Before the tale unfolds, take a moment to slow your breath. Let the weight of the day slip away from your shoulders. Wherever you are, find stillness. Close your eyes, if you'd like, or soften your gaze. Imagine warmth against your skin, the soft crackle of firewood nearby, and the scent of aged timber laced with lavender and smoke. You're not here anymore. You're there, somewhere far and long ago. Now, let me take you to a time when love was a ritual, and every whisper might carry a vow. In the valley of Elderwillow, where the mist clung to cobblestones at dawn, and owls ruled the dusk skies, strange customs bloomed like wild herbs. The people spoke in riddles when they spoke of love. Their courting dances were not done in ballrooms, but by moonlit wells. A favor might be a ribbon dipped in morning dew, a promise kept in the folds of a woven glove, and no one, absolutely no one, fell in love without passing through a trial of ancient, sometimes absurd traditions. At the edge of the village stood the manor of Branswick, tall and crooked with time, where a noble girl named Elswith watched the world from her high window. Her heart, though caged by family duty and lace-curtained walls, burned with quiet defiance. She had made a vow during the winter festival, one heard by half the town. "I shall not wed," she declared, voice ringing over frost-covered fields, "unless he proves his worth, not in battle but in custom." And so it began. The season of peculiar suitors, sacred riddles, and broken traditions. Now imagine, you are there, standing just beyond the last torchlit cottage, where the trees grow close, and the air smells like moss and iron. In the distance you hear the call of a horn. A traveller approaches. His cloak is heavy with snow, and his eyes are fixed on the manor windows glowing above the village. Tonight, someone comes to earn a heart, or lose his own. It was the third night of the frostbreak moon, when the ice on the village well cracked like thunder in the morning, and the blackbirds sang hours before the sun dared rise. In Elderwillow, this marked not only the shift of seasons, but the beginning of courtship trials, each one more bewildering than the last. The first was always the same, the piglet procession. In the heart of the village square, beneath garlands of dried lavender and painted eggshells, stood a long wooden pen filled with nearly a dozen piglets, each one wearing a coloured ribbon tied just behind its ears. Blue, yellow, red, green. They snorted and shuffled impatiently in the hay, while children tried to guess which one might bear this year's secret mark. You see, tradition held that one piglet, and only one, would be touched with a streak of sacred ash, marking it as the heart-bound. A suitor who wished to court a noble daughter had to enter the pen, select the correct piglet by intuition alone, lift it gently, and carry it the length of the village without dropping it or being muddied. The catch: he must do it in silence. Not a word, not a grunt, not even a laugh. Many had tried, many had failed. One even broke his arm on the cider barrel, trying to flee a particularly grumpy pig. But on this day, the villagers gathered early. The air buzzed with expectation. Children perched on barrels, old women clutched wool shawls tight to their throats, and Lady Elswith, wrapped in furs, watched from her manor balcony with unreadable eyes. The gate creaked. Sir Corwin of Fenmere stepped forward. Tall, solemn, and still wearing his riding cloak, he approached the pen with no hesitation. His boots sank into the half-frozen mud. A hush fell over the square as he stood before the piglets, his shadow stretching long in the morning light. Would he guess? Would he dare? Now imagine, you're watching from the crowd. You smell roasting chestnuts and the sharp bite of pine in the air. You feel the tension crackle like dry straw. A knight in mud-stained leather, surrounded by squealing piglets, must find a path to love by honoring a custom as ridiculous as it is sacred. And somewhere above, the wind carries the faint sound of a girl laughing behind a window. Some say love is a battlefield. In Elderwillow, it was more often a farmyard. Sir Corwin stood still among the piglets, who sniffed his boots with damp snouts and tangled tails. The ribboned creatures shuffled and grunted, their tiny hooves clicking over the wooden floor like rain on stone. Somewhere behind him, a boy sneezed. A girl giggled. The knight did not move. He closed his eyes. According to the old texts, scribbled half-legibly in the village almanac, success in the piglet procession came from following the rhythm of the heart. The chosen piglet would supposedly pause for breath 3 times, bow its head twice, and nuzzle the left boot. Or was it the right? No one really knew. Still, the knight reached down slowly, his leather glove hovering above a small grey piglet with a red ribbon. It blinked up at him, entirely unimpressed. He reached farther toward a darker one with a yellow tie, and gently lifted it. A snort escaped, but it didn't struggle. The crowd leaned in. Corwin took his first step, then another. Mud clung to his boots, thick and heavy, but he was steady, until a tiny villager, no older than 4, darted forward with a pastry in hand and shouted, "Pick the pink one, mister. That one's lucky." Corwin turned his head ever so slightly and smiled. It was innocent, barely a twitch at the corner of his mouth. No words, no gesture, but the village elder, Mistress Oldwine, slammed her cane into the ground. "Disqualified," she croaked. "Smiles count." The crowd gasped. The piglet wriggled free and dropped into the mud, squealing with glee. And somewhere above, behind the ivy-draped window, Lady Ellsworth sighed and smiled a little herself. Another suitor undone. Now imagine, you're among the villagers, bundled in wool and cider warmed from within, watching love stumble once again at the feet of tradition. Above, snowflakes drift lazily down. The ritual may be silly, but its sting is real, and in the manor, Ellsworth turns from the window. Her hand lingers on the glass. Tomorrow brings a new custom, a new challenge, and perhaps a new chance. In Elderwillow, the customs of courtship were not merely rituals. They were games of wit, honor, and sometimes quiet humiliation. After the spectacle of the piglet procession, the next trial came swiftly, as if the village itself could not bear to wait. The banners from yesterday still fluttered from rooftops when the villagers began preparing for the whispering garland. This custom was older than the manor itself, believed to have been born from a tale of 2 lovers who spoke only in flowers and shadows, afraid that their families would tear them apart. It was a ritual of secrets carried by the wind. At the edge of the willow grove, a circle had been woven from reeds and bramble, strung together with threadbare garlands of early spring blooms, snowdrops, primrose, and bits of lavender. In the center stood a stone seat, where the noble daughter would sit, blindfolded and silent. Around her, suitors would pass one by one, each granted a single whisper into her ear, just 3 words. They must not touch her, they must not name themselves, and most of all, they must not lie. If her heart stirred, she would nod. If not, she would say nothing, and they must walk away, never knowing whether their words failed or simply came too late. Lady Ellsworth arrived with no veil or crown, only a simple cloak of wool and a sash dyed with elderberries. She sat calmly on the stone seat, hands folded, eyes already covered in linen. 10 suitors approached that day. Some whispered poetry, some confessed fears. One said, simply, "I bring bread." But then came a young monk from Southmarch, barely 20, his robes too long, his voice uncertain. He knelt beside her and leaned close. "I forgive you," he said. Ellsworth did not stir, but her hands, unnoticed by most, clenched once, then relaxed. He walked away in silence, his face pale as milk. Behind him, the garlands swayed with the breeze, carrying faint perfumes and heavier thoughts. Now imagine, you sit in the grove, the earth still damp from snowmelt, the scent of crushed petals in the air. Around you, villagers whisper guesses. Some scoff, others seem moved. Above it all, the lady remains still, blind to the faces, but not to the weight of words. Some hearts are won by boldness, others by something softer, stranger. That night, as the village settled into slumber, and the last fire crackles faded into coal, Lady Ellsworth lay awake beneath her embroidered canopy, staring up at the wooden beams of her chamber ceiling. Outside, the wind coiled through the ivy like a ghost searching for a name. Inside, her room was still, save for the slow creak of timbers and the faint tick of a copper clock, her mother's heirloom. But sleep, when it came heavily, and with it, a dream. She stood at the edge of a frozen lake, dressed not in wool, but in silks of grey and pearl. In her hand she held a mirror, old and rimmed with rusted silver. Its glass was clouded, but through it she could see things, faces she didn't recognize, laughter without sound, a boy chasing a swan through a hedge maze. Then the dream shifted. The lake cracked. Beneath her feet, thorned vines began to push through the ice, wrapping her ankles, tugging downward. She turned, trying to flee, but a voice echoed from across the water. To love is to be known is to bleed. The vines cut into her skin, the mirror fell, and just before she was swallowed by the thorns, she saw her own face, not aged or broken, but smiling, serene, as if she had chosen this. She awoke gasping, one hand gripping the edge of her pillow, the other clutched to her chest. She said nothing of the dream to her handmaid, nor to her father, who visited with tea and talk of dowries. But she walked slower that morning, spoke softer, and when she passed the willow grove, she paused for a long time, one hand brushing the lowest branch. Something was stirring, whether in her or around her, she couldn't say. Now imagine, you're alone in a cold stone room, the light just beginning to bleed through shuttered windows. You can still feel the dream clinging to your limbs, like vines. You wonder, was it a warning, a memory, or a whisper from something deeper? Outside, another day begins, and with it, the next test of the heart. In Elder Willow, some customs were written in books, others were carved into doorposts or passed down in lullabies. But a few lived only in the hush between sunset and nightfall, those quiet moments when the light was soft enough to make strangers look familiar. One such ritual was known simply as the custom of shared chateaus. It wasn't announced like the others. No bells rang, no crowd gathered. Instead, it began when two people, unwed, uncertain, and unspoken, walked the path around the western field just after sundown. If by the end of that walk their shadows overlapped and lingered together beneath the first lantern post, they were believed to share a fate, but they had to remain silent the entire way. Not a word, not even a glance behind, and if either shadow broke from the other before the final step, they were cursed to never understand one another, no matter how long they lived. Elswith knew this custom. She had heard of it whispered during weaving circles and firelit tales. She had never tried it, not until that evening. She was at the edge of the manor grounds when she saw someone waiting, a figure in a green hood, standing just before the gate that led to the western path. No introduction, no gesture, just a nod. She didn't speak, neither did he, and so they walked. The snow had melted into soft mud and spring grass. The lanterns were not yet lit. All around them, the sound of frogs rising from their thawed burrows mingled with the breath of sleeping trees. They walked for 10 minutes, neither too slow nor too fast. Their shadows, long and slightly blurred by the setting sun, followed them, not quite touching, not quite apart. But then, at the final bend, Elswith stumbled slightly, just a slip on the root of a willow, no more than a step, and in that moment, his shadow moved ahead. The gap between them grew, just a hand's width, but enough. By the time they reached the lantern post, their shadows fell on opposite sides of the stone. She turned to look at him, but he had already walked on, disappearing around the curve of the manor's rear garden. Now imagine, you've just walked in silence beside someone whose name you barely know, and yet whose presence feels heavy in your ribs. But a single misstep, a heartbeat of distance, might mean the custom has judged your bond unworthy. The shadow doesn't lie, it only reflects what might have been. The villagers of Elderwillow had many sayings, but the one most often spoken with narrowed eyes and hushed voices was this: no heart wanders here by accident. So when a stranger arrived the next morning, cloaked in ash-grey wool with no sigil or escort, the whispers began before the gate even closed behind him. He said no name, he carried no banner, and yet he walked with the calm of someone who already knew the roads. He appeared first at the bakery, exchanging silver for a loaf no longer warm, then at the old well, where he traced a finger along the rim, reading the carvings there like a scholar might a sacred book. When the children followed at a distance, trying to guess whether he was a knight, a bard, or a ghost, he simply turned and bowed, deep, graceful, and silent. The rumors grew faster than the spring wind. He's a prince in hiding, one said. He's come to test Elswith, said another. He's not come for Elswith at all, whispered a third. He's come for vengeance. By dusk, he stood outside the manor gates. He did not knock, he did not call out. He waited. Lady Elswith, seated at the high window with a spindle in her hand, saw him standing beneath the last rays of sun. Something about his stillness unnerved her. Not threat, exactly, but a kind of knowing. As though he saw through the bricks, the curtains, and straight into her. She rose and descended the stairs, but by the time she reached the gate, he was gone. Only the scent of birch smoke lingered, faint and out of place. Now imagine, you are looking through a frost-blurred window at the last light of day, and someone stands just beyond it. You cannot see his face, but you feel, as surely as a storm approaching, that he is not lost, he is waiting, and tomorrow a new custom will rise. On the 8th day of courtship season, tradition dictated a test not of strength or silence, but of subtlety. A ritual as old as the orchard stones and just as unyielding. It was called the Trial of Vine and Ink. It required no arena, no procession, only a slip of parchment, a sprig of vine, and the courage to speak without being seen. The rules were simple. Each suitor must deliver an anonymous message to the lady's table by sunrise. The message must be composed in vinegar ink, a writing that faded after one reading, and tied with a vine freshly cut from the old stone wall in the southern garden. The message could contain anything: a poem, a confession, a story, or even a single word, but no names and no repetition. If the message stirred the lady's heart, she would tie the same vine into her hair the next day as a silent sign. Elswith found the basket of messages placed outside her chamber, just after dawn. 10 slips of folded parchment, each with its own scent: rosemary, moss, parchment dust. She took them one by one, unfolding carefully, the vinegar ink fading as her eyes moved. I saw your shadow walk beside mine. I never wanted it to leave. Love, like fire, asks nothing, but takes. Do not marry a name. Marry a silence that matches your own. A thorn cut me yesterday. I bled your name. One message, however, was different. No poetry, no metaphor, no plea. It read simply: come to the well at dusk. Do not speak. Bring the ribbon you wore on the frost moon. Her fingers froze. Only one man had seen that ribbon, woven with frost thread and tucked beneath her cloak, and she had never shown it. Without a word, she folded the message, placed it into the fire, and watched the flames curl around the vine. The next morning she wore it, braided into her hair, just above the left ear. The village noticed. So did the cloaked stranger, standing at the far end of the market. Now imagine, you've sent a message into the unknown, unsure whether it would be read, let alone received. Now you see your words walking down the lane, alive in another's step, woven in another's breath, and all the while, the well waits, silent and deep, like a secret held too long. The well behind Elderwillow Manor was older than the road, older than the chapel, and some said older than love itself. It was carved from pale granite, its lip covered in moss and names etched by candlelight over generations. Some names were paired with hearts. Others had been scratched out, their partners long forgotten. It was said that if two souls met at the well after dusk and shared no words, only silence and presence, the well would remember them, and in remembering, it would bind them, forever or not at all. Elswith walked there just before the sky turned violet, ribbon still braided in her hair. Her steps were slow, deliberate, boots crunching on last year's leaves. She wore no jewels, only a plain wool cloak. Her heart beat too fast. He was already there, the cloaked stranger, standing beside the well as if he had always belonged to it. He didn't move as she approached, didn't speak. His face was still shadowed by the cowl, but she could sense his gaze steady and quiet, like the forest before rain. They stood side by side, neither one reaching out, neither one retreating. The silence stretched, and then slowly, the man removed something from his pocket, a small object wrapped in blue linen. He placed it gently on the stone rim of the well between them. Elswith looked down. A glove, worn leather, torn at the edge and stitched with golden thread. Her glove, lost weeks ago during the winter festival. She hadn't known anyone had found it. Her breath caught. She didn't speak, only reached forward and touched the glove, then left her hand there, resting on stone. The man did not touch her, did not ask for thanks. Instead, he stepped back, nodded once, and disappeared into the trees, his cloak sweeping over the roots like smoke. Now imagine, you've stood with someone without saying a word, and somehow, in that silence, something passes between you. Not love, not yet, but recognition, the kind that lives beneath speech, the kind a well might remember. And tomorrow, a decision will rise with the morning frost. In Elderwillow, news travelled faster than horses, carried not by messengers, but by bakers, shepherds and fishwives with sharp eyes and sharper tongues. And nothing fueled the morning bread line more than the scent of romance, or something dangerously close to it. By sunup, the story had already changed 3 times. He brought her a glove stitched with royal thread. That's Fenmere silk. No commoner owns that. I heard he whispered into the well, and the water glowed. No, he's her cousin from the coast. That's why it's all hush-hush. It's sorcery, I tell you. He didn't speak a word, and yet she smiled. Mistress Aldwine, of course, declared the whole matter against regulation, quoting from a leather-bound book she hadn't opened in 20 years. The blacksmith, meanwhile, offered free sharpening to anyone who could find out the stranger's name by sundown. Even the children joined in, planting garlic cloves along the stranger's path to ward off love spells, a trick they'd learned from their grandmothers. And yet beneath the laughter and guessing, something deeper stirred in the village's voice. A curiosity not just about Ellsworth's suitor, but about why this season felt different. Back at the manor, Ellsworth listened from the herb room, where she sorted dried chamomile and thyme into glass jars. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind drifted, replaying the quiet at the well, the presence beside her, the glove that should have been lost forever. She didn't speak of him, not even to her maid. But that evening, when she dressed for supper, she tucked a fresh clove of garlic into her pocket, not for protection, for mischief. Now imagine, you are walking through a village alive with rumor, every window cracked open, every corner a stage. You are no longer just a noble or a stranger. You are a story, retold with exaggeration and spice. But somewhere in it, truth hides, waiting to bloom. And soon the next custom will test what even the gossips can't see. Once a year, when the moon was low and the frost left silvery spirals across every shutter and sill, the people of Elderwillow gathered for a dance unlike any other. There were no fiddlers, no drums, no bells on sleeves, only silence, and the sound of bare feet against cold stone. It was called the dance without music, and it was older than the Baron's line, rooted in a belief that true connection needed no rhythm, only instinct, that two souls who moved together without sound were more likely to move together through life. The square was lit only by lanterns, their flames shielded by glass tinted blue and green. Shadows melted across the ground like flowing ink. The cobbles had been scrubbed clean and dusted with lavender ash. At the edge of the gathering, villagers removed their shoes, placing them in baskets beneath the elder tree. Even the Baron's steward, known for his aching knees, stepped barefoot onto the stone. The rule was simple: find a partner, dance without a word, let your steps speak what your lips could not. Ellsworth arrived late. She wore a simple dress of slate-grey wool, no jewelry save for the garlic cloves still tucked in her pocket. As she stepped into the square, the murmur of the crowd faded, not from awe, but from anticipation. Would she choose someone, or be chosen? She didn't move at first, only watched. Then he appeared, the cloaked stranger, again in silence, stepped forward. But tonight, he removed his cloak entirely and placed it gently on the stones beside her. He extended a hand. She took it. Together, they stepped onto the center stones. No music rose, but they moved, slowly at first, then in soft circles, their feet barely making a sound. His hand hovered at her waist without pressing. Her fingers rested on his shoulder like snow on a branch. The village watched, breath caught. They moved like shadows cast by the same flame. And then at the end, they stopped, not in a dip or a flourish, but in stillness, their foreheads nearly touching. No kiss, no applause, just silence. Now imagine, you are part of that hush, feet bare, heart full, witnessing something fragile and wordless take shape before your eyes. You cannot name it, you do not dare interrupt it, but you know, this is how the old ones said love began. Tucked between two leaning cypress trees, beyond the herb fields and the old millstone path, stood a crumbling chapel long forgotten by scripture and schedule. It bore no name on the door, only a carving of a moth, wings spread wide, body curled around a small flame. Few visited it now. The stone benches were covered in moss, and the wooden beams groaned with time. But long ago, it had been the place where lovers sought the blessing of unspoken things, a rite rarely practiced and barely remembered. They called it the Chapel of Moths, and its only requirement was this: speak nothing, burn something, leave before the last ember dies. Ellsworth awoke before dawn, unsure whether she'd dreamed the name or heard it spoken in the space between waking and sleep. But something pulled her there, something soft and insistent. She left the manor quietly, cloak wrapped tight, hands trembling not from cold but from anticipation. She found him waiting, the stranger, no longer cloaked, though his face still bore the quiet distance of one who carried more memory than he shared. He stood at the chapel's arched entry, his breath visible in the morning chill. Together they entered. Inside, only the altar remained, a slab of limestone with a copper bowl at its center, darkened by centuries of ash. Ellsworth stepped forward. She pulled the ribbon from her hair, the same one she had worn since the trial of wine and ink, and placed it gently into the bowl. The man followed. From his pocket, he removed a small square of fabric, a child's mitten, threadbare, embroidered with the letter E. No questions were asked. He struck a match, the bowl filled with flame. They stood in silence, watching the fabric curl, the ribbon twist. Then, before the last ember faded, They turned and left, without looking back. Now imagine, you are in a space forgotten by time, where moths sleep in the rafters and the air tastes of burnt offerings. You feel something leave you, some thread, or fear, or grief, and something else rise in its place. Not quite love, not yet, but something honest, and watching. In Elderwillow, even truth had a season. And during courtship, it often came dressed in ribbons and riddles, served cold by fools with silver bells on their shoes. Every year, just after the dance without music, and before the choosing fire, the village held what was called the Day of Jest. It was a strange tradition, half festival, half trial, a day when the jester, appointed by lottery or mischief, had full license to lie, to provoke, to stir. The goal was simple: uncover the hidden truths of courting hearts, by any means necessary. This year, the role had fallen to Maren, the candlemaker's second daughter, clever, sharp-tongued, and utterly fearless. She wore a patchwork coat, bells on her elbows, and a hat shaped like a duck's head. In one hand she carried a goose feather, in the other, a bell that rang once every time she told a lie. She circled the square like a hawk, calling out names, spinning stories, and daring couples to reveal what they'd rather bury. The Baron's steward left a glove in the baker's bed. Elsewith's stranger as a spirit come to steal her voice. A secret kiss was seen at the old forge, 2 shadows, 1 vow. Each time the villagers gasped. Some laughed, others paled. The rules said no one could refute the jester, not allowed. But if the jester's words rang true, the bell would remain silent. When she finally reached Elswith, the square had quieted. Maren approached slowly, feather swaying. "Lady of Lace," she sang, "why do you braid a stranger's glove into your ribbon? Is he your knight, your curse, or your ruin? Did you know he carries a name older than this village? Did you dream of fire before he arrived?" The bell in her hand never rang. Elswith did not speak, but she did something few had ever seen her do. She stepped forward and plucked the feather from Maren's fingers. Then, gently, placed it into her own braid. The jester bowed, deep, as if the truth had finally bent her spine. Now imagine, you are surrounded by laughter that hides questions too sharp for daylight. Someone dances around your heart, pointing and teasing, but never wounding, unless the truth lets them in. And now, the village knows something it didn't before. The stranger carries weight, and Elswith carries it too. At the edge of Elderwillow, where the fields turned wild, and the land began to remember things it hadn't spoken in centuries, there stood a lone blackthorn tree. It was gnarled and silver-barked, branches sharp as truth, and always blooming out of season. White blossoms in winter, blood red in spring. No birds nested there, no children climbed it. But for lovers, especially those whose hearts were not yet spoken, it was a place of binding oaths and buried secrets. The custom was simple, but sacred. 2 people, neither bound nor yet betrothed, could tie a ribbon together upon the blackthorn, 1 ribbon from each, knotted without words, placed upon a branch while the moon sat high. If the knot held through the week, it meant fate would not oppose them. If it came undone before dawn, they were never meant to last. That night, under a sky bruised with stars, Elswith stood beneath the blackthorn tree. She had come alone, at first, but just before the moon reached its highest point, she heard footsteps, not bold like a knight's, but quiet and certain, like someone returning to a place they never left. The stranger arrived with a ribbon in his hand, navy blue, frayed at one end, stained faintly with wax. She held her own, the same elderberry-dyed ribbon she had worn since the well. No words. They each tied their ribbon into a single knot around one branch, his left, hers right, fingers brushing only once, barely more than breath. The knot held. They stepped back. She looked at him then, fully, without veil or window between them. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and stopped. Instead, he bowed his head, turned, and walked away. Now imagine, you stand before an ancient tree that bears witness to promises too dangerous for daylight. You offer a piece of yourself, not as gift, but as thread. The wind moves, but the knot holds, for now. On the 15th night of courtship season, the sky broke. Not with thunder at first, but with a stillness too heavy to ignore. Birds vanished, dogs whimpered, even the wind went quiet, as though the world itself paused to inhale. Then came the rain, heavy, urgent, and full of memory. In Elderwillow, rain had its own law. It was said to uncover what sunlight buried, to wash the dust from hidden truths, and pull lies from between the cobbles. And on this night, it did exactly that. It began with a scream, not a cry of pain, but of shock, echoing from the western slope, near the wash-house where linens were hung even through the storm. A maid, running barefoot and soaked to the bone, shouting that she'd seen them, seen Elswith and the stranger, together beneath the blackthorn, hands locked, faces close. She tied the ribbon herself. He kissed her hand like a husband. The Baron must be told. The news spread like fire in dry hay. By the time Elswith returned to the manor, soaked and silent, her father stood waiting in the great hall, arms crossed, jaw set like stone. He asked no questions, only said, "We will speak in the morning." But scandal doesn't sleep. It spreads. By midnight, 3 rival families had offered to rescue Elswith's honor through arranged proposals. The abbess sent a letter. The Baron's steward polished his boots in hope. Even the village crier hinted that the stranger might be driven out at dawn. The only one who said nothing was Elswith. She sat alone in her chamber, staring at her empty windowsill. The ribbon was gone, blown loose by the storm, the knot undone, or perhaps untied. Now imagine, you have walked a careful path, stone by stone, and now rain has come to wash it clean, or wash it away. Whispers chase your name. Doors you once opened are now shut. And yet outside, someone still waits, soaked, unspoken, but not gone. There is a custom in Elderwillow, quiet, old, and rarely invoked. It takes place before fire, not a hearth nor a torch, but a ceremonial blaze built at the center of the manor courtyard, fed with cedar, old scrolls, and juniper oil. It is called the choosing fire. By tradition, a noblewoman of age must make a declaration before it, one name, spoken clearly, before all who listen. If no name is given, it means the season ends without a match, and no man may court her again for a full year. To name someone is a binding mark, though not yet marriage. It is a claim of recognition. To name no one is a different kind of power. By dusk, the manor courtyard was filled. Torches lined the walls. Guards stood in silence. The villagers packed the edges, some shivering, some craning their necks to see Elswith as she emerged from the great doors. She wore no jewels, only a dark green gown with sleeves that swept like ivy. Her father stood to one side, face unreadable. The Baron's steward cleared his throat, then called out, "Lady Elswith of Branswick, you stand before the choosing fire. Do you come with a name?" The flames crackled, casting gold across her face. She looked out at the crowd. Then, to everyone's surprise, she stepped back, one step, then another, until she stood beyond the fire's reach, and said, "No name, not yet." A murmur swept through the courtyard. Some gasped, others nodded. Her father's brow darkened, but he did not stop her. She bowed her head and turned away, but just before she disappeared into the shadows, someone stepped forward, the cloaked stranger, no longer cloaked, his tunic rain-damp, boots caked in mud. He said only this, "Then neither shall I speak," and he too turned, vanishing into the gathering dark. Now imagine, you are standing before fire, heat against your skin, knowing every word is being weighed by dozens of eyes. To say a name is to be seen, to say none is to protect something not yet ready to bloom. Tonight, both of them chose silence, but silence is not the same as surrender. Once a year, after the choosing fire, but before the first spring sowing, the villagers of Elderwillow set up a hidden market, a market not marked on any map. They called it Red Lace. It appeared at dawn and was gone before nightfall. No bells announced it, no signs pointed the way, yet everyone knew when it was time. Only one rule governed the market. You may trade only what you do not wish to lose. The booths were strange and crooked, strung together with red ribbons and old veils. Beneath patched tents and smoky candles, sellers offered things not found in any other place. A laugh in a bottle, a promise sealed in salt, the final page of a letter never sent. Some villagers sold memories, others names, but many came to bargain for answers. Elswith arrived with her hood drawn low. She carried nothing in her hands, but in her pocket, folded small, was the vinegar ink message she had never burned. The one that said, "Come to the well at dusk." The same writing, the same scent. She found the booth by accident or fate. An old woman with teeth like wet stones and eyes like frost. "I sell clarity," she croaked, "but I'll need something soft. Something you haven't hardened yet." Elswith thought, and reached into her braid. She pulled out the last thread of the blue ribbon, the piece that had survived the storm, and placed it in the woman's cracked bowl. The woman sniffed, then smiled. "He carries 2 truths," she whispered. "One he hides from the world, one he hides from himself." Elswith asked nothing more, but when she left the booth, the vinegar message had vanished from her pocket. Now imagine, you walk among stalls that shimmer like mirages, where the currency is not coin but conviction. You give up something precious, not knowing if what you gain will heal you or haunt you, and somewhere in the crowd, someone else is trading too, for a way back to you. The well had changed. Not in shape or stone, those were the same, but in feeling, in weight. Where once it felt like a place of possibility, now it felt paused, as if it were waiting, as if it knew that a silence left too long becomes something harder than words, a question with no mouth. It was just past dusk when Elswith returned. The path was clear, no wind, no watchers. The manor lights flickered far behind her like stars through fog. She stood at the well's edge once more, hands tucked into her sleeves, heart quieter than usual. Then he came, the stranger, no longer cloaked, no longer even a stranger. He approached slowly, as though unsure if he would be welcome. He stopped across from her, eyes meeting hers in the lantern's dim glow. Still, no words, so Elswith broke the rule. She spoke first. "Why did you come here?" His voice, when it came, was low and dry, like leaves caught beneath the floorboards. "Because this is where you forgot me." She blinked. "What? Before the trials, before the season, you were 8. You fell from that tree behind the chapel. I carried you home. You looked at me and said, 'You smell like winter and secrets.'" Elswith's breath caught, a half memory, mud, stars, the taste of iron. "You disappeared after that." She whispered. "I was taken away, sent to the southern monks. They gave me a new name, one I no longer wear. Why didn't you say something sooner?" He smiled, just barely. "Because I wanted you to see me now, not as a shadow from then." They stood in silence again, but this time, the silence was shared, and the well, ancient and watchful, made no sound. But deep within, the water stirred, just once, as if remembering too. Now imagine, you return to the place where everything began, only to find it changed, because you have changed. And the person before you is not just a stranger, not just a ghost, but something rarer, a forgotten truth, returned in time. In the manor archives, hidden behind war ledgers and marriage decrees, there lived a forgotten custom, the laurel of memory. Once long ago, it was a test for grieving widows, to see if they still remembered their first love. But over time, it had become something gentler, more curious. Now, it was reserved for those whose hearts had once been lost, and perhaps returned. The ritual required a crown, not of gold, but of laurel leaves dipped in honey water and bound with flax thread. At dawn, the would-be lover must walk the orchard path blindfolded. Along the way, voices, familiar and false, would call to them from either side. Some voices were friends, others deceivers. Only one belonged to the person they sought. If they paused at the right voice and removed the blindfold, the laurel would hold its shape and the bond would be blessed. If not, the leaves would blacken and the love declared hollow. Elswith stood in the orchard barefoot, the grass still cold with dew. The laurel crown rested in her hands, fresh, fragrant, trembling. Behind her, her maid tied the blindfold. No one else spoke. Then, silence. She walked forward, one step, then another. The trees arched above her like a vaulted chapel. Then came the voices. "Elswith, I remember the song you hummed when you were small. Turn left, the ribbon is still in my coat. You smiled when I dropped the piglet. I came back for you." She stopped. One voice, calm, not pleading, not proud, just there. She turned toward it and lifted the blindfold. The laurel stayed green. The villagers watching from the edge of the grove exhaled as one. From behind the last row of trees, the man stepped forward, not hidden anymore, not waiting. He knelt, and Elswith, without hesitation, placed the laurel crown on his head. Now imagine, you have wandered through the forest of memory, uncertain if what you once held can ever be reclaimed. And then there it is, still rooted, still alive. And this time, you choose it with both eyes open. There was only one trial left. Not dramatic, not secretive, not performed under moonlight or in silence. This one took place in daylight, at a simple wooden table, with villagers as witnesses, and nothing to shield the hearts of those involved. It was called the Salted Bread Pact, a final test of honesty, of taste, of truth, spoken plainly. The custom was this. 2 would-be lovers must each bake a loaf of bread, shaped by hand and salted without measurement. On the crust, they must carve a single word, one word that speaks their heart. They then sit across from one another, break the loaves and eat. If the flavors are balanced, neither too bitter nor too bland, the pact is sealed. But if the salt stings or vanishes, the bond is judged unripe. And once the loaves are eaten, Both must speak aloud the word they carved. No lies, no hesitations, no riddles, just the truth, baked and broken. Elswith stood in the manor kitchen that morning, sleeves rolled high, hands dusted with flour and fire. She worked alone, refusing help. Her word she carved with the point of a butter knife, a word she had never dared speak before. At the same hour, he, now known to all as Corwin, no longer cloaked in mystery, shaped his dough in a room behind the blacksmith's shed, eyes focused, fingers steady. He used no spice, only salt, only memory. When they met in the village square, the table had already been set. Wooden boards, pewter plates, nothing more. They exchanged loaves, broke them, ate. No one spoke as they chewed, except a child who whispered, "She's smiling." Then Elswith placed her hand on the table and said, "Mine was belonging." Corwin looked at her. Mine was return. The wind shifted, the sun climbed higher, and the villagers, they began to clap. Not loud, not showy, but steady. The pact had held. Now imagine, you sit at a table not to feast, but to reveal. The bread in your hands tastes not just of salt and grain, but of everything you've hidden and everything you hope for. And now, at last, your heart has spoken and been heard. In Elderwillow, when a couple completed all trials and declared their pact in bread and word, the village itself responded, not with official decree or trumpet's call, but with a quieter ritual, the ribboned door. At dawn the next morning, the front door of the woman's home would be adorned with ribbons by the hands of the villagers, each one carrying a wish, a warning, or a blessing. Some were silk, some were burlap, some were bits of cloth from old shirts or baby blankets, but each held meaning, and together they turned a wooden door into a tapestry of the village's memory. Elswith awoke that morning to a strange silence, not of absence, but of waiting. She opened her window and saw them, dozens of villagers, standing outside the manor gate, holding ribbons in hand, whispering as they tied them to the knocker, the hinges, the iron handle. One said, "For laughter, shared even in sorrow." Another, "For firelight in the winter of the heart." One read simply, "Remember the well." By the time the sun reached its highest point, the door had vanished beneath colour, and in that colour there was no suspicion left, no shadow, no scandal, only celebration. Corwin came shortly after, dressed plainly, his laurel crown now dry and darkening, but still whole. He did not enter. Instead, he tied his own ribbon, navy blue, frayed at the end, the same thread that had once bound him to silence. Elswith opened the door herself, and when she stepped out, the crowd fell quiet. She took his hand. Together they walked the village. No parade, no procession, just steps. But every home they passed, every window they crossed, bloomed with tied ribbons. Now imagine, you've been tested, watched, whispered about, and weighed. Now the world that once waited for your fall ties its hopes around your door. You walk not into marriage, but into meaning, and perhaps into love. At the end of a courtship season in Elderwillow, whether it ended in vows, silence, or heartbreak, there was always a feast, not for nobles, not for suitors, but for everyone. It was called the Feast of Twined Spoons, a celebration rooted not in ceremony, but in shared survival. For even love, they believed, must feed the village. The rules were playful and strange. Each guest brought one spoon. No one could use their own. To eat, you had to trade. It meant no one dined alone. No one ate in silence. And somewhere during the meal, someone, usually the oldest woman present, would stand and say, "Every spoon holds a story. If you share food, share that too." So the stories began. Children recited tales of animals falling in love with humans. Young couples shared their awkward first words. Old men confessed to secrets buried since the time of war. When it came to Elswith and Corwin, no one asked directly, but someone passed them spoons carved from the same branch, two halves of a broken bough. Corwin held his in both hands, then whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Once, I was a boy lost in the orchard. She gave me a name I didn't understand, and when I returned, she gave it back." Elswith smiled. "Once, I thought love had to shout, but it turns out it can arrive barefoot, silent, and carrying a glove." Laughter rippled, bread passed, mead poured, and all through the feast, the spoons twined and traded until no one knew whose was whose. But no one minded, because in Elderwillow, love was not a secret to be hoarded, it was a story to be fed. Now imagine, you are seated among 100 voices, holding a spoon once carved for someone else, tasting stew that feels like memory. Around you, laughter and tears braid together like ribbon and wind. You realize this is how love lingers, not in the vows, but in the sharing. When the last candles of the Feast of Twined Spoons burned low, and the village bell marked the hour before midnight, Elder Willow shifted into its final custom of the season, the night of unnamed gifts. No announcements, no speeches, just the rustle of paper, the soft creak of doors, the quiet movement of hands leaving something behind. It was a night for gratitude without credit, for thank yous never spoken aloud, for kindness paid forward, for love returned in the smallest, most private ways. Villagers crept through the dark with careful steps and covered baskets. Some left hand-carved toys on windowsills for children whose parents had gone hungry during winter. Others slipped bread into the satchels of the widowed or weary. A shawl was hung on the blacksmith's fence embroidered with birds, though no one claimed it. Even the chapel of moths received a gift, a new copper bowl, polished and quietly placed upon the altar. Elswith left her gift just before the first snowflake fell. She crept to the door of the candlemaker's home and left behind her last piece of ribbon, folded around a feather, Marin's jester feather, kept since the day of riddles. She left no note, only a sprig of thyme for courage. Far across the village, Corwin climbed the slope to the orchard and tucked a small wooden box beneath the blackthorn tree. Inside, a child's mitten, the original, not the one burned in the chapel. Beside it, a single page. Some things we do not lose, we only wait to return them. No one claimed to give, no one asked who had given what, and by dawn, all gifts had vanished, only warmth remained. Now imagine, you wake to find something waiting on your doorstep, small but meant. You don't know who left it, but you know someone remembered, someone saw you, and that, perhaps, is love's quietest form. There was one last rite, rarely spoken aloud, never written down. It had no altar, no offering, no audience. It was called simply the custom of 3 silences. Those who knew of it believed that true love, if it was to last beyond a single season or a lifetime, must survive not passion, but stillness. That before 2 hearts could be joined, they must pass through 3 silences, one chosen, one forced, and one shared. It was said the couple must find their way to a quiet place, no ceremony, no invitation. They must wait together. The first silence, of choice, the decision not to speak. The second, of distance, where one must leave and the other must remain. The third, of presence, when both return, not with words, but with knowing. Few ever completed it, fewer still, even tried. But on the final morning of the season, Elswith rose before dawn. She packed no satchel, took no ribbon, wore no laurel. She found Corwin, waiting by the orchard path, just where it bent toward the hills. He didn't speak, neither did she. The first silence began. They walked side by side into the rising mist, past the chapel, the frozen well, the grove of shadows. Then, she stopped. He turned. She gave him a single look, eyes calm, hand at her side. Then she turned back, returning alone to the village. The second silence held. 3 days passed. Rain fell. Snow followed. Then, on the 4th day, the sun broke through. At sunset, Elswith stood again at the bend. Corwin appeared, not with flowers, nor a speech, nor a gift, just his hand, offered. She took it, and without a word, without a need for one, they began to walk, together. The third silence was shared, and it was full. Now imagine, you have spoken all the vows, crossed every distance, faced every whisper, and still, the most powerful moment comes not in a kiss or a promise, but in a silence where everything has already been said, and finally, nothing more is needed. In Elder Willow, not all weddings were marked by bells and feasts. Some were whispered, some were walked into slowly, without fanfare or flowers. Some were made beneath the very garland, where first words were never spoken. It was the same circle of vines and fading spring blooms, tired now but still standing, woven with snowdrops, primrose, and the last bits of lavender. Weeks ago, Elswith had sat within it, blindfolded, listening to the quiet promises of unseen voices. Now, she returned. No guests were summoned, no paper signed, no procession walked, only Corwin waited within the circle, dressed in the same simple tunic he wore on the day of the choosing fire. And Elswith, no veil, no crown, stepped barefoot over the garland's threshold. They stood face to face. Above them, petals drifted on a breeze like half-remembered words. Around them, no one watched, but something listened. They spoke only once. Elswith, I choose this. Corwin, and I return. No kiss followed. Not yet. Instead, they knelt, each plucking a petal from the garland, and then, rising, they stepped out of the circle together, not bound by law or loud applause, but by something older and more enduring, the quiet that lingers when a truth has been spoken in full. Now imagine, you stand not before a crowd, but beside the person who has walked with you through fire, folly, and silence. You say nothing grand, nothing clever. You speak simply, and it is enough, because the garland remembers, because you remember. Some stories end with a kiss, others with a crown, but in Elderwillow, the story of love often ended with a door opening or closing, and sometimes both. After the wedding beneath the whispering garland, Ellsworth and Corwin returned to Branswick Manor, not as daughter and stranger, not as noble and suitor, but as two who had chosen each other beyond ritual, gossip, or permission. The manor, tall and stone-shadowed, seemed unchanged, but its silence greeted them differently. At the gates the steward waited, not stern, not scowling, but quiet. He gave a single nod and stepped aside. Inside, the great hall was empty. The tapestries hung straight, the candles flickered low, and at the foot of the spiral stair her father stood. The Baron, not armoured, not angry, just a father in twilight. He looked at Corwin, then at Ellsworth, then turned and opened the great door to the east wing. "This part of the manor has been locked since your mother died," he said, "but it is yours now, if you want it." Ellsworth did not answer. She simply stepped forward, took Corwin's hand, and crossed the threshold. Inside, dust danced in golden light. The hearth had not been lit in years, but the air was not cold. Outside, unseen, one door closed. Behind them, another opened. Some stories end that way, not with a wedding, not with a farewell, but with the turning of a key in a long-forgotten lock. Now imagine, you return to a place filled with memory and silence, and for the first time it does not feel like a cage. It feels like possibility, and the person beside you does not lead you in. They walk in with you. Brunswick Manor had many names for its many rooms, some sweet, some strange, some never said after dark. But the East Wing held one chamber long whispered about, even by those who had never seen it, the Laurel Room, named not for the crown Corwin wore, nor for any tree that grew nearby, but for the creeping laurel vines carved into the walls, leaf by leaf, winding through plaster like veins. It was said the room remembered love, but also loss, and sometimes those memories stirred. Ellsworth opened the door slowly. Dust shifted, light fell in long golden stripes across faded cushions and an unlit hearth. On the far wall above a narrow bench hung a portrait, her mother's, painted in the spring of her youth. Beside the painting, something unexpected, a mark, faint and low on the wood, a name, scratched by a child's hand. "They let me rest here. Your mother brought me bread." Ellsworth turned. "She never told me. She didn't need to," he said. "She let the house remember. But not all memories rest easy." That night, as the hearth finally burned and the windows began to hum with wind, they both awoke at once. No sound, just presence, a heaviness in the far corner where no candlelight reached, not menacing, not sad, just waiting. Ellsworth sat up. She whispered into the dark, "You can stay, but we live here now." The air softened, and the next morning, the laurel vines on the wall seemed somehow greener. Now imagine, you walk into a room that holds all the ghosts of what was loved before you, but instead of fear, you offer welcome, and in return, the past loosens its grip, and the house becomes a home. Spring does not ask permission. It returns boldly, melting frost, cracking earth, coaxing green from grey. And in Elderwillow, spring came not with ceremony, but with gardens that spoke in silence. Every leaf, every sprout, every petal was a kind of memory, and the garden behind Branswick Manor had many. Some forgotten, some waiting, some finally ready to bloom. The first morning of spring, Corwin rose early, not to hunt, not to ride, but to dig. The spade was heavy, the soil still cold, but he worked quietly, clearing weeds, turning earth, mending the stone borders left to crumble. Ellsworth joined him just before sunbreak, holding two things, a tin box of seeds marked only WM, and a clay pot filled with black dirt from the chapel grove. They planted together, no map, no pattern. Lavender near the bench, strawberries near the steps, and in the far corner, near the tangled lilac, they buried something neither spoke of, the remains of a broken ribbon, and the wooden spoon she never returned from the feast. By mid-season, the garden had transformed, birds returned, vines reached the windows, and villagers, once hesitant, began leaving cuttings and herbs at the manor gate. A girl brought thyme, a widow, rosemary. Someone left a slip of parchment that read, "The house is breathing again." Elswith pinned it to the shed wall with a thorn. One afternoon, Corwin knelt beside a strange sprout, silver-veined and pale. "Did we plant this?" he asked. Elswith looked at it closely, then shook her head. "No, I think the house did. Now imagine, you wake to sunlight on the floor, the scent of damp earth in the air, and someone humming softly in the garden. The world beyond may still carry burdens, but here, among roots, petals and memory, life is beginning again, with you." Some stories are not told with words. They wait, in drawers, in chests, in the hollow backs of shelves no one has dusted. And one day, when the time is right, they rise. Elder Willow Manor was old enough to forget many things, but it had not forgotten the letters. It began when Elswith shifted the old portrait of her mother. Behind it, tucked in the wooden paneling, was a small iron box sealed with beeswax and a faded braid of hair. Inside, parchment, stiff, yellowed, dozens of letters, folded and sealed with the family crest, all addressed to the same name, to E.W., but none had ever been delivered. Elswith carried the box down to the garden and sat beside Corwin beneath the lilac tree. One by one they opened them. "My darling girl, you will not remember the smell of the orchard at dusk, but I remember your laughter chasing it away. I did not love your father when we wed. I learnt to, but I loved you before you were born. They told me not to speak of the stranger boy, that it would confuse you, but he brought you home that day, and that, I think, was the beginning of your story. Some letters were soft, others aching. One had no words at all, just a pressed snowdrop, dry and whisper thin. By the end, Elswith was silent. Corwin said nothing, but he placed his hand over hers and whispered. She knew. Elswith nodded. And now, so do I. That night, they burned the final letter in the garden fire, not to forget it, but to let it go. The smoke carried upward, curling like a ribbon toward the stars. Now imagine, you open a page meant for you, written before you knew who you were, and as you read, you do not mourn what was missed. You give it breath, you give it space, and it finally reaches you. In Elderwillow, the height of summer was not marked by clocks or calendars. It was known by the breath of the earth, thick with honey, ripe with bloom, loud with bird song and bees. And when the first red poppy bloomed on the hillside, villagers would say, "Now begins the season of promises," not oaths for others to hear, not vows etched in stone, but private truths, spoken where only sky and soil might listen. Elswith and Corwin chose the orchard, not the part near the house, but the far end, where the trees grew older, roots tangled, leaves heavy with scent. They walked there barefoot, hands twined loosely, dressed in linen and dust. No one followed. They found the tree, twisted, thick, hollowed at the base. The same tree where Corwin had once carved their initials as a boy. They stood before it. No ring, no priest, no recitation, just the air between them, alive and listening. Corwin spoke first. "I don't vow to never change. I vow to never leave when we do." Elswith stepped forward. "I won't ask you to carry me, only to walk beside me, even when the path splits." He reached into the hollow of the tree and placed something inside, the silver laurel leaf from their wedding crown. She followed, pressing a dried snowdrop beside it. No one would see them again, but that was the point. Some promises are not for proving, only for keeping. Now imagine, you stand before something living and old, and offer it your most quiet truth. No applause, no witness, no certainty. But the wind shifts, the leaves turn, and you know you were heard. Towards summer's end, when the wind began to carry a hint of wood smoke, and the nights stretched their shadows just a little longer, Elderwillow prepared for one final revel, the festival of Ashwine. It was a time to say goodbye to the season, to honor what was grown, what was gathered, and what was lost. But above all, it was a night when the past returned to dance. The name came from an old drink, a smoky red wine steeped with ashberries and rosemary, said to help the living remember and the forgotten find rest. The villagers wore costumes of those who came before, grandmothers' dresses, soldiers' coats, forgotten cloaks found in attics. They danced beneath lanterns shaped like feathers and flames, and at midnight they set small paper boats afloat down the stream, each one carrying a name, a wish, or a sorrow. Elswith had never attended before. Her father always said it was for dreamers and drunks, but this year she arrived arm in arm with Corwin, both dressed not in nobility, but in memory. She wore her mother's shawl. He wore the monk's robe he had once been forced to live inside. They danced, not like nobles, not like strangers, but like those who had passed through the fire and chosen to stay warm together. And at the water's edge, they knelt together and lit a paper boat. Corwin whispered into it, "For the boy who waited too long." Elswith whispered, "For the girl who thought she had to be perfect." The boat caught flame and drifted. Now imagine, you stand in a sea of flickering light, surrounded by people wearing the skin of old stories. You release something you've held too tightly. You dance, not to forget, but to remember kindly. Because the past isn't a chain, it's a lantern, and tonight, you let it glow. There are moments when words become too heavy, too blunt, too sharp, or simply too loud. In Elderwillow, such moments were not avoided. They were given their own space, their own custom. It was called the whisper kiss. Long ago, when nobles and peasants alike feared that spies lingered even in the garden hedges, couples who wished to speak true affection without being overheard created a private ritual. The rule was simple: if the words could not be said aloud, they must be whispered, not into the ear, but into the lips. A whisper so soft it kissed, a kiss so quiet it confessed, and it could never be asked for, only offered. Elswith knew this custom, but she had never dared use it until the night after Ashwine. She and Corwin sat on the roof of the east wing, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the stars slide slow across the sky. The village below was asleep. The firelight in windows dimmed. A soft wind pulled her hair forward. He said nothing, but she turned to him and leaned in, not with urgency, not with need, but with a truth too tender for language. Her lips found his, and she whispered into them, "Thank you for coming back." Corwin did not reply, not with words, but his arms tightened. His forehead rested against hers, and his breath was steady and warm and there. Now imagine, you carry something small but burning inside you, a truth too delicate to drop into the world, and instead of speaking, you lean close enough to let your breath carry it. Not for sound, but for sense, and the one who hears it, they never need to answer, because now it lives between you. Not all promises are kept, and in Elderwillow, that truth was not hidden away. It was carved, brick by brick, into stone. At the northern edge of the village, just beyond the moss-covered trail, stood a crumbling stretch of wall, too short for defense, too narrow to mark any land. It was called the Wall of Forgotten Vows. There was no ceremony attached, no festival, no crowd. If a vow had been broken, by choice, by circumstance, by time, the custom was simple. You brought something small, something once given in love, and you left it at the wall, not to erase the past, but to lay it down, so it would not follow you. One morning, near the end of harvest, Elswith awoke early. Corwin was still asleep, his breath deep and calm. She dressed quietly, stepped into her boots, and left the manor through the garden gate. In her pocket, she carried a single item, the glove, the one he had returned, the one she had kept. She reached the wall before the sun rose fully. Others had left things, withered rings, snapped hairpins, notes faded into rain ink. She placed the glove gently among them and whispered, "Not forgotten, just finished." Then she turned away. When she returned home, Corwin was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hands dusted with flour. He looked up and smiled. He didn't ask where she had gone. He didn't need to. Some silences are made of understanding. Now imagine, you hold something that once meant everything, but now feels like a memory with no weight. You find a place built for it. And when you walk away, you don't feel emptier. You feel more whole, because now your hands are free. In Elderwillow, when two lives joined not through ceremony, but through time and tending, the village offered no crown, no scroll, no title. Instead, it offered a room, or rather, the naming of one. Each home in Elderwillow had a room without a name, a spare chamber, unused, a place meant for something not yet imagined. When love settled, not rushed, not announced, but proven, the custom was to name that room, together. The new name would be carved above the door, with the first shared tool, often a kitchen knife, a gardening spade, a piece of chalk worn down to its edge. It was a small act, quiet, but once done, the home was no longer two people living side by side. It was theirs. One chilly afternoon, Elswith and Corwin stood before the old storage room behind the garden steps. Once filled with firewood and broken baskets, it now held drying herbs, a copper basin, and two mismatched chairs. They had sat there often, in silence, in conversation, in days both heavy and light. It was not grand, not beautiful, but it was theirs. Corwin held the carving chisel. Ellsworth touched the beam above the door. "What shall we call it?" he asked. She smiled. "The room between seasons." He carved it slowly, not straight, not perfect, but honest. When it was done, they stepped inside together and lit the oil lamp. For the first time, it felt like a beginning, not of love, but of life. Now imagine. You walk into a space that once held nothing but dust and the past. You place your name upon it, not just yours alone, but joined with another. And suddenly, the walls feel warmer, the air softer, because this isn't just a room, it's a choice. Elder Willow knew how to count love. Not in years, not in gifts, but in light. One night each year, just as autumn leaned into frost, couples across the village observed a quiet ritual, known only as the Evening of 7 Candles. It wasn't required, it wasn't announced, but if two hearts had endured the seasons, if they had shared harvest and hunger, laughter and silence, they would gather 7 candles, light them and sit. Each flame stood for something. 1. The first glance. 2. The moment of doubt. 3. The shared secret. 4. The first sorrow. 5. The silence survived. 6. The choice to stay. 7. The promise of tomorrow. No words had to be spoken. The candles would burn, and the couple would watch them, together, in stillness. If all 7 burned without flickering out, it was said the bond would hold for another year. That evening, Ellsworth and Corwin cleared the little table in the room between seasons. They placed 7 uneven candles on a dish of river stones. The room was quiet but full. The fire crackled low. The tea steamed in clay cups. Outside, wind pressed gently at the shutters. They lit each flame, one by one in silence. The second candle nearly died, twice. Once when the wind pushed through the chimney. Once when Corwin stirred in his chair and the movement made the flame shiver. Ellsworth reached across the table. He stilled. The flame settled, and the rest burned steady. Hours passed. No one spoke. But when the 7th candle reached its final flicker, Corwin exhaled slowly. "Still here," he whispered. Ellsworth nodded. "Still us. Now imagine. You sit across from the one you've chosen, not measuring your time together in grand moments, but in 7 small flames. You say nothing, but when the last one fades, you feel no fear, only warmth. Because love is not loud, but it lasts. There are secrets that hurt, secrets that heal, and some that simply wait, buried beneath hearthstones, tucked into old satchels, held close for reasons long forgotten." In Elder Willow, one ancient rite offered a place for such truths to finally surface. It was known as the dagger, with an oath, not a ritual of blood or violence, but of clarity. Once each autumn, at the edge of the harvest fields, a ceremonial dagger was laid on a stone altar. Anyone with an oath unspoken, a truth withheld from the one they loved, could come and hold the dagger. If the truth was shared while holding the blade, the binding of silence would be broken, and the past would loosen its grip. But the custom required one thing: the truth must be spoken in full, with no expectation of forgiveness, and no hope of forgetting, just told. Corwin found the dagger one mist-covered morning, as villagers gathered their final sheaves of wheat. He said nothing, only wrapped it in cloth and brought it home. That evening, he lit a fire in the room between seasons, and placed the blade on the table. Ellsworth entered, saw it, and paused. "There's something you never told me," she said. He nodded, and picked up the dagger. "When I was taken from Elder Willow, after I saved you that day in the orchard, I wasn't sent to the monks for safety," he said quietly. "I was sold." The word fell like ash. "My father owed debts. He gave me as payment to the southern cloisters. I wasn't meant to return." Ellsworth didn't move. He laid the dagger down. Its tip touched the wood with a soft sound. "I never told you, because I didn't want your pity to stain your love." She stepped forward, took his hand. "Then let this be my truth," she said. "I loved you before I knew what you'd endured, and I love you more now that I do." The fire crackled. The blade gleamed once, then dulled again. Its duty fulfilled. Now imagine, you carry a secret like a stone in your chest, and when it is finally laid down, it doesn't break the bond, it deepens it. Not all truths are beautiful, but all truths deserve a place at the table. Some gifts are not meant for celebration. They are not wrapped in joy, nor offered with a smile, but still, they are given. And sometimes, they arrive exactly when the heart begins to wonder if it has been seen at all. In Elder Willow, such a gift was often marked by red lace. It was an old tradition, kept alive by the village widows. When a widow found that love had truly returned to the village, not as a flirtation or a ceremony, but as a bond weathered and real, she would send a token, a piece of red lace, once meant for her own wedding day, passed on to those who reminded her that love endures. No one ever asked for it, no one ever expected it, and not every couple received it. But when it came, it was always needed. Ellsworth and Corwin found the package on their doorstep after the first frost, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with ivy, and sealed with a mark neither had seen before, a curling swan stitched into wax. Inside lay a folded square of crimson lace, thick, hand-woven, frayed at the corners. No note, no name, only a single thread sewn into the hem in faded ink. For the ones who stayed. Ellsworth pressed it to her face and breathed in cedar, ash and lavender. "It's from Widow Braith," she said softly. She never remarried, never even spoke of her husband after the war. Corwin held the lace in both hands, reverently. "Why now?" Ellsworth didn't answer. She simply folded it again and placed it into the drawer where they kept the things they didn't yet understand but could not throw away. Now imagine, you receive something from someone who does not owe you a kindness, who owes the world nothing, and gives anyway. A piece of sorrow, reshaped into grace. You do not wear it, but it stays with you. Not all weddings are planned. Some grow in silence, like ivy beneath stone. Some gather slowly, like embers beneath ash. Too small to warm a room, too quiet to notice at first, until one morning, the room is full of heat. In Elder Willow, this was called an ember wedding, a bond not spoken in chapel, not witnessed by crowd or custom, but built over time, fireside by fireside, choice by choice, until one day it was. There was no day marked on the calendar, no announcement, no paper signed, just a morning when Ellsworth stirred the garden soil and looked up to find Corwin at the kitchen window, grinning softly, flour on his brow, and she thought, there is no one else I would wait out a winter with. That night, they sat in the room between seasons, wrapped in a single blanket, the fire low and golden. Corwin took her hand. "We never picked a date," he said. "I think we passed it," she replied. "How many months ago? Does it matter?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, not at all." She leaned into him, and they stayed that way, long after the fire burned to coal. The next day, Ellsworth wove the red lace from Widow Braith into a curtain over the window, not to display it, but to let the light pass through it, just as it had passed through them. Now imagine, you reach no altar, you walk no aisle, but one day you look up and realize you are home, not just in place, but in person. You didn't marry with trumpets or crowds, you simply stayed, and that, in Elder Willow, was the fiercest vow of all. Winter in Elder Willow did not arrive with storms. It crept, like frost over glass, like breath fading from the air, like a hush that settled deep into the roots of everything, even the loudest hearts. And so came the season, known only as the midwinter quiet. In this season, the village slowed, the markets closed early, chores were done in half light, and within homes, couples who had once been wrapped in passion and trials now wrapped themselves in wool and stillness, because here, even love learned to rest. Ellsworth and Corwin spent their days in muted rhythm. They lit only 2 candles at night, shared thick broth and bread in silence, read aloud until the words began to slur into sleep, and then slept, not curled in hunger or heat, but like roots in the dark, deep, steady, waiting. One morning, Ellsworth awoke and did not rise. She simply lay there, watching the frost gather on the inside of the window, each crystal blooming like a soft declaration. "Are we fading?" she asked. Corwin, still half asleep, replied, "No, we're steeping." She laughed, once, then let her eyes fall closed again. For weeks, nothing changed. No new customs, no visitors, no great revelations, only the soft growth of love underground. Not dead, not asleep, just becoming. Now imagine, you lie beside someone you've chosen, not because the fire roars, but because the embers still glow. The world is frozen, but your breath is shared. Your silence is not emptiness, it is peace. Winter ends not with fanfare, but with a sound. A single, soft crack. Ice loosening its grip on the well's edge, snow slipping from a roof in the night. The quiet strain of sap rising again through old bark. In Elder Willow, this was called the first thaw, and when it came, the world shifted, so did the heart. Ellsworth heard it first, the creak of wood bending back to life, the drip of water pooling beneath the herb shelves, the call of a bird that hadn't sung since last leaf fall. She stood at the window of the room between seasons, palms pressed to the glass. Something in her chest, slow and warm, answered. She didn't speak it, she didn't name it, but she moved with it, out into the yard, boots crunching against softening earth. Corwin joined her without question, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. They walked the garden together, finding signs, crocus buds under mulch, beetle trails along the stone. One lost mitten, half frozen in the mud, his from weeks ago. He picked it up and grinned. "We've survived another cold." "We always do," she said. That night, as rain began to fall, not snow, but true rain, they opened every window in the house just a crack. Let the cold in, let the thaw find them. And as they lay in bed, listening to water fall from gutters and leaves, Elswith whispered, "I feel it waking again." Corwin's hand found hers. "So do I." Now imagine, you have weathered silence, shadow and snow. Then one morning you hear it, the soft shifting of life returning. You step outside, not to chase it, but to meet it. Because love doesn't just survive winter, it emerges. Some messages are never written. They're carried instead, between hands, between seasons, between the folds of everyday life. In Elder Willow, there was once a tradition, nearly forgotten, known as the painted fan. It began when a local artisan, long widowed, could no longer speak after illness. She learned to craft fans instead, each one a message in color, shape, and gesture. Soon lovers adopted the custom, not to flirt, not to court, but to remind that affection could be expressed without noise, that beauty itself could speak. That spring, Corwin found a small box beneath the garden bench. Inside, a folded fan of ivory parchment, painted with winding blue vines and dots of gold. He carried it to Elswith, curious. She smiled too softly for words and took it into her lap. "I made this before we were married," she said. "I kept it in case I ever forgot how to say something out loud." He unfolded it slowly. Painted within the last curve, in fine ink, was a single line: "When I cannot speak, I will still love you." From that day forward, the fan rested on their mantle, and when days turned heavy, when words stumbled, when quiet stretched too far, Elswith would simply lift it, open it, hold it between them, and Corwin would understand. Not everything needed to be said again. Now imagine, you hold something fragile, old, and beautiful, not for decoration, not for history, but because it carries something of you, painted in gestures, remembered in silence. And when the world grows loud, it becomes a voice of its own. In Elder Willow, there was a quiet art known to few, and mastered by even fewer, the language of linen. Not letters, not runes, but stitches, subtle patterns, hidden in hems and corners, used by generations of women to speak truths that could not be spoken aloud. A row of crooked daisies meant regret. A twisted border knot meant loyalty through change. A single thread left loose at the edge of a napkin, a question, waiting for answer. Elswith had learned the stitches from her grandmother, who never raised her voice but always made her meaning clear. And one rainy afternoon, when the garden was too wet to tend, and the village too quiet to visit, she pulled out the old basket of scraps. Corwin sat across from her, mending a harness strap, humming softly. She began stitching not out of need, but intention. A square of linen for the kitchen shelf, simple at first. Then 3 knots, curved at the edge, one long line of vine, unfinished, and a single red stitch, nearly hidden in the white. She didn't explain, just folded it, placed it on the shelf, and let it wait. 2 days later, she found it beside her tea. Corwin had added a single green loop to the corner. No words, just his answer. Now imagine, you live with someone not in poetry or ceremony, but in mornings and dishes and wool socks drying by the fire. And in that rhythm, you find ways to speak without noise. Because love, like linen, holds best when it's been stitched over time. Even in a village like Elder Willow, where love was layered in silence, custom and shadow, there had to be room for laughter. Not cruel, not careless, but healing. And once each year, the village gave itself permission to laugh at the one thing that most often made fools of them all: love. It was called the Festival of False Promises, a day of parody and play, where villagers dressed as exaggerated versions of themselves, courting maids with 10 ribbons, lovesick lads in paper armor, barons who begged for betrothal with baskets of moldy bread. Every couple, no matter how long wed or recently found, would participate by reenacting the worst version of their romance. The only rule: Make it ridiculous. And don't tell the truth until the punchline. Corwin and Ellsworth joined in that spring, hesitant at first, but by midday they were in full regalia. He wore a cloak made of stitched-together dish rags, a flower pot for a crown, and carried a scroll titled My 72 Proposals. Ellsworth donned a gown layered with doilies and kitchen towels, a ribbon stick labelled Trial Stick of Doom. Together, they performed a wildly inaccurate tale of their courtship. She demanded I chase a pig through the garden. He offered me a glove dipped in soup. She swore she'd only marry a man who could make 3 kinds of stew, and he burned the first 2. The villagers roared. Even the Baron laughed, nearly dropping his cider, and when Corwin knelt with exaggerated flair and bellowed, "Lady of Brunswick, I vow to name every potato in your garden after you if you'll have me." Ellsworth replied, "Only if you agree to sleep on the left side forevermore." They bowed, and the crowd clapped until the lanterns flickered. Now imagine, you stand beside the one you've endured every storm with, and together you pretend to fail on purpose. To laugh not at your love, but with it, and in that shared silliness, something stronger takes root, because joy is the shield that keeps love from wearing too thin. Among Elderwillow's stranger customs, few were as beloved or as baffling as the hound's choice. Born from an ancient belief that dogs could smell not only danger, but dishonesty, the ritual was used to test one thing: the sincerity of a couple's bond. It had no official rulebook, no sacred script, just a dog, a treat, and a moment of truth. Here's how it worked. A village hound, always the oldest, always the most stubborn, was brought to the green. The couple knelt, placed 2 tokens, one each, carrying their scent. Then they each offered the hound a bit of food, usually something personal. Whichever offering the hound accepted revealed who it trusted more. If it took neither, the match was declared uncooked. If it took both, well fed. But if it chose only one, that was said to mean something deeper. This year, the honoured beast was Wendell, a shaggy mutt with one blind eye and a fondness for cheese. Ellsworth offered a soft biscuit, wrapped in lavender. Corwin held out a bit of smoked fish, his own catch, from the river behind the mill. Wendell approached slowly, sniffed the biscuit, paused, snorted, then turned to the fish and devoured it whole. The villagers gasped. A few giggled. Corwin raised a brow. Ellsworth leaned close and whispered, "It only means you're fishier than me." They laughed together, and Wendell lay down between them, entirely unimpressed. Later, someone placed a ribbon around Wendell's neck, and he paraded through the village like a king. The verdict: match, mostly cooked, needs more seasoning. Now imagine, you kneel beside someone you love, and let fate be decided by a creature who wants nothing but snacks and sunshine. And yet in that absurdity, you find clarity. Because love, like dogs, needs no ceremony, only presence and trust. In Elderwillow, names meant everything. They carried lineage, duty, the weight of old stories. Some opened doors, others closed them. But once each year, all names were forgotten, for one night only. The tradition was called the banquet with no names. A great table was set in the center of the village green. Every villager, young and old, noble and common, was given the same plain robe, no colors, no sigils, no distinctions. Upon entering the banquet, you left your name behind, written on a slip of parchment, folded and sealed, placed into a wooden bowl at the edge of the table. For the next few hours, you were only who you chose to be. Ellsworth and Corwin arrived at twilight, hand in hand, robes tied loose at the waist. They offered no greetings, no curtsies, no titles. At the table they sat beside strangers who might have been neighbors, enemies, or old friends. It didn't matter. Bread was shared without question. Stories were told in the third person. Laughter didn't ask who you were. Midway through the meal, a girl stood up and sang, voice trembling, but unburdened. A farmer told a joke about 2 barons and a dancing goat. Someone confessed to stealing apples as a child, then tossed one across the table with a wink. Corwin leaned to Ellsworth. "No one knows we're the ones from the garland," he said. She smiled. "Good, let's just be the ones who brought the strawberries." He raised his cup. "To the ones we are, when no one's looking." They drank. At the end, the slips were burned in a quiet fire. No names were read, no records kept, but the memory lingered of a village where, for one night, everyone was only themselves, and it was more than enough. Now imagine, you sit beside someone whose title once weighed on you like a cloak, and realize you love them more without it. You eat, laugh, listen, and speak, not as who the world calls you, but as who you are when all is quiet. That's the truest kind of feast. There was one woman in Elder Willow who neither kept to village law nor bowed to noble rule. She had no chapel, no altar, and yet her blessing was more sought than any scroll-bearing cleric's. She was known as the Laughing Priestess, and her approval could not be earned, it had to be noticed. No one knew her true name. She had lived in the village for decades, grey-haired, sharp-eyed, barefoot through frost or flower. She spoke in riddles, dressed in layers of curtain cloth, and laughed like someone who had survived too many endings to take any beginning too seriously. Her blessing was simple. If she saw love, real love, she would approach without warning, press her thumb to your forehead, and say, "That'll do," nothing more. After that, she'd vanish for weeks, and no one dared question it. Elswith and Corwin had never met her properly, only glimpses at markets, passing gates, once in the orchard where she appeared only to scold a crow. But one late afternoon, as they sat beneath the willow tree outside the manor, pruning herbs and humming in tandem, she appeared. No footsteps, no shadow, just standing there, watching. She didn't speak, just pointed at the basket of herbs. "You've got too much rosemary," she muttered, "too much memory. Give some away." Then she stepped forward, pressed her thumb to Corwin's forehead, then to Elswith's, "That'll do," and laughed, the kind of laugh that made squirrels scatter. Then she left, walking straight into the woods as if she'd always lived there. They didn't follow, didn't speak for a long time. Then Corwin said, "That felt important." Elswith smiled. "It was. Now imagine, you live quietly, no longer seeking approval. Then one day, a voice you never thought to earn steps into your life, sees you clearly, and says, not with ceremony, but with certainty, yes. And somehow, it matters more than you expected. Every village has its impossible tale, told beside fires, repeated in kitchens, embroidered into quilts, and whispered when the night grows too still. In Elder Willow, that tale was always the same, the bride who rode a wolf. No one agreed on when it happened, or if it happened at all. Some said it was 2 generations ago, some said 10, but the bones of the story remained. A woman, strong-willed and strange, refused every suitor in the land. She claimed no one would ever match her in freedom or fire. Then, one night, when the river swelled and the stars danced low, she appeared at the village gates, riding a wolf, white as bone, eyes like gold, a wreath of frost flowers in her hair. She did not speak, she only pointed to a man waiting near the chapel. Some say he was a hunter, others, a man made of silence. All agree. He stepped forward, bowed, and climbed onto the wolf behind her. The next morning, the chapel doors were open, the hearth still warm, 2 cups on the table, but no bride, no groom, only a single line, carved into the altar. "Find someone who runs beside you." Elswith heard the tale as a child, but only now sitting beside Corwin, a fox napping at their feet, and the wind singing through the orchard, did she understand it. "Do you think she ever came back?" she asked. Corwin shook his head, then smiled. "I think she didn't need to." Elswith leaned back, eyes on the treetops. "If I rode a wolf, would you follow?" "If you rode a potato cart, I'd follow," he said. She laughed, and for a moment, she could almost hear a howl in the far hills. Now imagine, you sit beside someone, not because they caught you, but because they ran beside you, step for step. And even if your story sounds like legend, you know it's real, because you lived it. There are doors in Elder Willow that do not lead anywhere. No rooms, no root cellars, no passageways. Just wood, nailed into walls or trees, painted with symbols, colors, and scenes too vivid to ignore. They are called prophecy doors, and once a year, someone paints a new one. No one knows who. It always appears overnight. No one sees the hand that guides the brush. But what's painted always comes true. Some show a goat on a rooftop, some a child holding a fish bigger than their head. Once, a door showed a bouquet of snowdrops 2 weeks before the first thaw. The villagers call them harmless, whimsical. But when the door shows a person, especially someone known, everyone takes notice. This spring, a new door appeared at the edge of the herb path behind Branswyck Manor. Fresh paint, still drying. It showed a garden in bloom, recognizable as theirs. 2 chairs beneath the lilac tree, a basket of strawberries, a pair of hands, one weathered and calloused, the other pale and ink-stained, reaching toward a cradle. Elswith found it first. She stood before it for a long while, not speaking. Corwin joined her, a mug of tea in hand. He followed her gaze, then stilled. "We didn't talk about—" "I know," she said, We don't have to. They stood together, listening to the bees, the wind, the far-off call of the village bell. Then Corwin said, "It's only paint." Elswith nodded. "But maybe it's also hope." They didn't speak of it again that week, but she placed a sprig of lilac at the base of the painted door, just in case. Now imagine, you come across an image of your life, not as it is, but as it might be. And even though nothing is promised, and nothing is planned, you begin to prepare a place in your heart for what could come. Not because you expect it, but because you're ready to welcome it. In a village where seasons turned like clockwork, and customs ruled even the air between breaths, the idea of love without legacy seemed unfinished. But there was an older custom, seldom spoken aloud, but still passed between knowing eyes. It was called the childless blessing, a recognition, a protection, and above all, a choice. When two people joined in deep love and chose not to grow their family by children, either by decision, by time, or by fate, the village elders would still offer a blessing, but not in public. Instead, a small stone, round, smooth, and marked with a circle, would be placed on the doorstep of the couple's home on the first night of the new moon. No explanation, no ceremony, just a silent mark. You are whole as you are. Elswith and Corwin found their stone after the festival of Ashwine. It sat in a nest of straw on the sill of the room between seasons. No ribbon, no name, only the circle, painted in quiet gold. Elswith picked it up slowly, held it in her hands. "So they know," she whispered. Corwin stepped behind her. "Let them." She smiled, then turned the stone over. On the back, carved so faintly it could only be read by fingers, was one word: enough. They placed the stone on their mantle, between the dried fan and the feathered spoon. It did not weep, it did not bloom, it simply stayed, as they would. Now imagine, you live in a world that often asks for more, for heirs, for legacy, for noise, and then someone or something whispers back, "This love is already complete, this life is already full," and you believe it. Every village remembers in its own way. Some keep books, others pass songs, but in Elder Willow, stories are preserved on shields. The custom is ancient, older than the barony, older than the roads. Once a year, the village blacksmith and the eldest weaver come together to craft a single ceremonial shield, wood at the center, iron rim, linen-bound face. It's not for war, it's for memory. Etched, stitched, and painted into its face is the story that mattered most that year. Not always the loudest, not always the grandest, but the one that moved the village in ways it could not forget. That spring, the shield was unveiled during the planting festival. No one knew whose story would be chosen. When the cloth dropped, the crowd fell silent, etched in soft relief. A pair of hands tying ribbon into a tree, a glove resting on a well, a piglet in a patch of mud, a pair of spoons crossed, a painted fan, a room labeled between seasons. And in the center, two figures, one with wild hair, one with a crooked smile, seated beneath a tree, heavy with lilac and thyme. At the bottom, 3 words carved in elder tongue. They stayed true. Elswith stepped forward first. She said nothing, only placed her hand on the shield, palm flat. Corwin followed. He placed the smooth stone marked enough beside it, and the village, quiet for once, let the moment stretch. Because sometimes a story becomes a part of the place that held it, and the people who lived it become part of the place. Now imagine, you see your life reflected, not in mirror or memory, but in something the world built to remember you by. And for once, you do not feel exposed, you feel seen. And finally, you know you are home. In Elder Willow, not all endings are goodbyes. Some are acknowledgements, some are quiet bows to the story just told. Some are simply farewells. And for those there was a final tradition, the farewell of 5 petals. When a tale in the village had come full circle, when nothing more needed to be proved or protected, it was customary to release 5 petals into the wind. No more, no fewer. Each petal stood for something that had been earned. One for truth, one for silence, one for sorrow, one for laughter, and one for the choice to stay. The petals were often from the same flower that had marked the beginning of the journey. For some, a snowdrop. For others, lilac. For Elswith and Corwin, it was elderflower. They climbed the hill behind the manor at dusk, carrying a small pouch. No villagers followed, no one needed to. The wind was light, the sky layered with lavender and grey. Together, they opened the pouch. Elswith let one petal fall, then Corwin. Back and forth they went, each releasing a moment into the air. No words, just breath, just memory. When the last petal vanished into the wind, they sat down on the grass and leaned into each other, not as the beginning of something, not as its end, but as the ones who had lived it. Now imagine, you stand with someone who knows every version of you, the storming, the soft, the silent, and when the time comes to mark what has passed, you do so not in grief, but in grace, because you know, no love is ever truly finished, only fulfilled. Some stories do not end. They pause, they soften, they settle like earth after rain. But somewhere, a new shoot rises. In Elderwillow, this idea was captured in a simple act, easily missed, quietly done. A door left unlocked. It wasn't a ritual, not quite a tradition, but those who had lived through love, the kind that burned, healed and stayed, often chose not to latch the garden gate, or to leave one candle burning in the window, not for safety, but for invitation. Ellsworth and Corwin had no more customs to follow, no more trials to face. Their names had been stitched, painted, planted and whispered through every corridor of the village. But one morning, just before dawn, Ellsworth walked to the side door of the room between seasons, unlocked it, and tied a ribbon to the handle. Not a new ribbon, an old one, frayed, elderberry dyed, worn by time and memory. Later that day, a child from the village, curious and barefoot, stepped through that door. She found Ellsworth pouring tea, humming something soft. Corwin was in the garden, waving. "Are you a queen?" the girl asked. "No," Ellsworth smiled. "I just know a lot of stories. Can I hear one? Only if you promise not to believe every word." The child nodded solemnly and sat. Now imagine, you leave something open, not because you expect someone to enter, but because you hope someday someone will. And when they do, you are ready. Not with proof or purpose, but with presence, and a story that knows how to begin again. Stories in Elderwillow were never truly finished. They were stitched, folded, tucked between generations like herbs in a chest. And when it was time for the tale to move beyond the ones who lived it, it passed, not in books, but through the hands of a weaver. There was always one, not chosen, not trained, simply known. Someone who understood threads like emotions, knots like seasons, color like memory. The weaver would take the fragments left behind, ribbons, lace, dried petals, a frayed bit of linen, and blend them into something new, a cloth, not for wearing, but for remembering. This year's weaver was unexpected, not old, not particularly wise, but attentive, a young man with ink on his sleeves and a habit of listening more than speaking. He came to Ellsworth and Corwin's door one crisp morning. "Do you still have the fan?" he asked. She brought it out carefully, wrapped in muslin. "I want to use part of the edge for the border." Corwin returned moments later with the broken spoon from the Feast of Twine Spoons, wrapped in silk. "You can take this too." Weeks passed, and then on the morning of the frost bloom, the cloth was unveiled in the center of the village green, woven into its surface. The piglet, the glove, the vine-wrapped garland, the laurel crown, the 7 candles, and 2 figures, walking barefoot, ribbon trailing behind them. At the bottom, a single stitched line. They remembered. Now imagine, you live your days not for legacy, but in love, and one day, someone younger, quieter, asks to carry a piece of it forward, not to copy, but to weave it into something living. You say yes, and your story begins to walk without you. The tree was still there, twisted, thick-rooted, older than the manor, older, some said, than the village itself. The same tree where Corwin had once carved their initials. The same tree beneath which they had planted their first truth. The tree that had listened without judgment and kept every secret in its bark. In Elderwillow, it was known now as the Lover's Tree. No sign marked it, no plaque, only the wear of many footsteps and the hush that fell whenever someone stepped beneath its branches. Couples came to tie ribbons, children came to climb, but no one sat in the hollow, not since Ellsworth and Corwin, until today. Grey now touched Ellsworth's hair. Corwin moved more slowly, leaning slightly to one side. But when they arrived at the tree, they didn't feel old, they felt right. She reached into her satchel and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He took a slow breath, recognizing it by the shape. The spoon? She nodded. It was no longer broken, mended with a line of gold, the kind used in the Eastern art of kintsugi, where cracks are not hidden, but honored. They dug gently into the earth near the roots, placed the spoon inside, and covered it again. Then they sat. No vow, no prayer, just breath, bark, and the low rhythm of a life well spent. The tree rustled, as if sighing with them, and Ellsworth whispered, "We began here." Corwin nodded, "And we ended nowhere. Now imagine, you return to the place that once marked your beginning, not to rewind, not to relive, but to rest. You have nothing left to prove, and everything left to feel, because some circles don't close, they expand." The frost came late that year, thicker than usual, sharp across windows, bold on branches. It lingered deep into spring, long enough that some feared the flowers wouldn't bloom at all. But Elder Willow knew better, because in every corner of the village, from every dark patch of earth, there was a saying passed down: where love has warmed the ground, bloom always returns. Elder Willow knew better. She wrapped herself in the red lace shawl, the one passed from Widow Braith, the one that now smelled like old paper and rosemary. She stepped into the garden and paused. There, beneath the lilac tree, where once they had promised without witness and named the room between seasons, was a single stubborn bloom, elderflower, white as milk, gold at the edges, tiny petals unfolding like memory itself. She knelt beside it, touched it with fingers not quite steady. Behind her, Corwin appeared at the threshold. "It's early," he said. "It's right on time," she replied. They didn't speak further. Instead, they tended the rest of the garden in silence, together. The frost had left its mark, but so had the fire they had kept through every season. Now imagine, you fear something may never return. A feeling, a season, a softness. Then one day, quietly, without fanfare, it blooms again. Not because you forced it, but because you made space for it. Because love doesn't sleep, it rests. And always, always, it wakes. In most places, becoming a legend means fading into memory, a name spoken in past tense, a tale told only by firelight and elders with slow voices. But in Elder Willow, legends walked the lanes. They still baked bread, still fetched water, still kissed each other's foreheads without performance. And when the time came, they were not tucked away, they were invited. Once each year, a gathering was held in the Hall of Weathered Wood, a low stone building with smoke-black beams and windows that fogged with stories. Here, the village elders met not to lead, but to listen. They invited one couple, every year, whose love had endured, not the newest, not the loudest, but the most rooted. This year, the invitation came in the form of a folded cloth napkin placed on the doorstep. Inside it, a single elderflower petal and a note. "It is time you told the tale, not lived it." Ellsworth and Corwin stood at the front of the hall, not dressed in finery, but in what they wore every day, linen, worn at the cuffs, soft from time. Around them, young faces leaned forward, notebooks ready, eyes wide, but Corwin didn't speak at first. He only pulled something from his pocket, the carved spoon, repaired, weathered, still whole. He held it up. "We began with this," he said. "We nearly ended with it. But what matters isn't that it broke." He passed it to a girl in the front row. "What matters is that we chose to mend it." Ellsworth smiled. "The customs are strange," she said, "but the story beneath them is always the same." She leaned forward. "Love, when it stays, teaches you who you truly are, and that is a story worth telling. Now imagine, you are invited not to remember someone else's story, but to tell your own. Not because it was perfect, but because it endured. And now, it's ready to become a map for those just beginning. Because when love becomes tradition, it never ends." In the village of Elder Willow, fire was never just warmth. It was memory. It was legacy, and someone always had to tend it. Every season, one household was entrusted to keep the ceremonial flame alive, not for ritual or show, but so that the village knew, even in the deepest night, the heart of its history still burned. They were called the Firekeepers. For 3 years, Ellsworth and Corwin had kept that flame. They fed it gently, read stories beside it, sang lullabies to it when storms howled through the pines. But this year, the time had come to pass it on. The new firekeeper was not expected. A girl no older than 14, quiet, sharp-eyed, quick with her hands and slow with her words. But Ellsworth had seen how she paused in front of the manor gate each morning, how she always brought extra kindling to the winter store, how she once whispered, when she thought no one heard, "I think I could keep it." And so, one calm evening, Ellsworth placed a copper bowl of flame into her hands. Corwin added a pinch of elderflower and said, "It doesn't need to be big, it just needs to never go out." The girl nodded. No promises, no panic, just quiet readiness. And as she walked away with the flame, a small breeze stirred through the orchard. Ellsworth watched her go. "Do you think she'll manage?" Corwin asked. "She already is," Ellsworth replied. Now imagine, you hold something not because it is yours forever, but because it must be cared for until someone else is ready, and one day they are, and you hand it over, not with sadness, but with certainty, because love is not a possession, it is a legacy. Not every tradition in Elderwillow was grand. Some were made of feathers and thread. Some were tucked beneath heads and hidden in sleep. One such custom was passed from weaver to weaver, family to family, the pillow of first dreams. It was believed that the first pillow you laid your head on in a new home would shape the nature of the life lived there. Not by magic, not by spell, but by memory. Whatever you dreamed on that pillow's first night would linger, not forever, but long enough to guide your hands when choices came. When the young firekeeper received her first fire bowl, she also received a gift, a hand-stitched pillowcase from Ellsworth, soft linen, stuffed with straw and goose down, one edge embroidered with the simple shape of a spoon and fan. A note was sewn into the seam. It read, "Rest kindly, remember gently, begin truly." That night, the girl placed her head upon it. No one knows what she dreamed, but the next morning, she lit the fire without matches. She spoke her first words aloud in days, and she hummed an old lullaby that Ellsworth had not sung in years. Ellsworth and Corwin watched from their garden gate. They said nothing, only squeezed hands softly, because they knew some stories do not end. They lie down and begin again. Now imagine, you create something small and soft for someone else, expecting nothing in return, and through that quiet gift, a new story wakes. Because beginnings don't always roar, sometimes they whisper. Some bells are rung in warning, others in grief. Some to mark time slipping past, never to return. But in Elderwillow, once a year, a bell was rung for something else entirely. Hope. The tradition was simple, so simple, many forgot where it began. Each spring, on the eve of planting, the village gathered near the old iron bell mounted on the edge of the orchard. The same bell that once warned of wolves, of war, of fire. Now it stood, polished and weather-worn, waiting for a single chime. The bell of the future. It could only be rung by one person, someone who had loved deeply, lost something along the way, and still chosen to stay. The act wasn't about optimism. It wasn't about pretending everything would be easy. It was about saying with hands and metal, "Even so, I will go forward." This year, the elders named Ellsworth. She didn't object. She didn't ask why. She only stepped to the rope, her red shawl brushing the grass. Corwin watching with hands clasped behind his back. She took a breath, then pulled. The bell's note was low, golden, clean. It echoed across the orchard, down the hill, through the square, into windows and hearths. It did not command, it invited. Later that evening, as stars bloomed above the thatch roofs, a child asked Corwin, "What happens now?" He looked at Ellsworth. She looked at the firekeeper's window, glowing still, and said, "Now, we keep going. Now imagine, you live long enough not to be wise but to be steady, and one day, the village turns to you, not for answers, but for your willingness to hope. You ring the bell, and even the trees seem to lean in, because forward is not a direction, it is a decision." In Elderwillow, the oldest landmark wasn't a church, nor a manor, nor a well. It was the circle of stones. 7 flat stones set in a ring, worn smooth by footsteps over centuries. Each stone represented a phase of life: birth, trial, doubt, love, loss, choice, and return. The ritual, when someone significant reached what the villagers called a living story, a life marked by seasons of the heart. They were invited to walk the circle at dawn. They stepped from stone to stone, pausing on each: Rans, birth, remembering beginnings; trial, acknowledging hardship; doubt, honoring uncertainty; love, recognizing connection; loss, allowing grief; choice, embracing agency; return, standing whole. Afterward, they left a small token on the center stone, a reminder of their journey. Ellsworth and Corwin came hand in hand at first light, drawn by the bell's echo and the ripple it sent through memory. They moved together. Ran, on birth, Corwin touched the name carved in the stone of their childless blessing. On trial, Ellsworth laid a feather from the night of unnamed gifts. On doubt, they paused longest, yet neither faltered. On love, they both placed a fresh ribbon, twined together. On loss, they left the kintsugi spoon's broken piece. On choice, they each knelt and touched the stone of return. And finally, on return, they stood, side by side, and laid down the repaired wooden spoon. Now imagine, you step through your own life circle, each stone a mirror, each pause an echo, and when you reach the center, you are not who you were, but someone who has lived and who continues. Because every step is a story retold, and every retelling is a life reclaimed. In the heart of Elder Willow, beside the old weaving shed and the trail that led to the orchard, there lay a plot of land untouched by trade or title. It was known simply as the Garden of Shared Seeds. Here, no one owned a row, no one claimed the yield. It was a space for offerings, not of coin, but of possibility. When someone reached a turning in their story, marriage, departure, forgiveness, return, they planted something, not for themselves, for the village, for the next. The soil remembered everything: tears from the widow's onion patch, hope from the young couple's time, grief folded into blackberry brambles. And when the harvest came, all were fed, but no one asked whose hand had sown it. Elswith brought elderflower seeds, small, ivory, like dust in the palm. Corwin brought fennel, seeds wrapped in waxed paper from his mother's kitchen. They kneeled side by side, planted in silence, and as they patted the earth down, Elswith whispered, "Not for us." "But maybe," Corwin added, "because of us." The garden would bloom in patches. Some seeds would sleep through seasons, some would burst too soon, but all of them would carry story, and somewhere, someone would eat from that story and carry it on. Now imagine, you plant something not to harvest, but to hope. You won't see it flower, but someone else will, and that is enough, because some roots run forward, and love always leaves something behind. There's a bench by the river in Elder Willow, built from weathered oak, smooth as water-worn stone. No plaque, no carving, only a place to rest where the current runs steady, and the air always smells of wet bark and memory. It is where villagers go when they wish to sit with their past, not to fix it, not to mourn it, just to be with it. Elswith found herself there one morning, long after the planting, long after the circle of stones. She wasn't seeking answers, only a pause. In her lap, the painted fan, repaired. In her hand, a cup of warm honey milk. The river gurgled softly, somewhere upstream. A heron called once and was silent. She closed her eyes. Then footsteps, slow, familiar. Corwin, of course. He sat beside her without a word, sighing the way someone does when they've finally allowed themselves to be still. "Thinking of old things?" he asked. "No," she said. "Then what?" She opened her eyes. "Just remembering that I don't need to think at all." He smiled, took her free hand. Together, they watched a leaf float past, bright, gold-tipped, carried without struggle. Later, they would return home, bake bread, feed the fire. But for now, they sat, not speaking, not planning, just letting the river carry the weight for a while. Now imagine, you carry your life like a bundle. One day, you lay it down beside moving water, not to abandon it, but to feel how light it becomes when shared. And in that stillness, you remember, the past does not pull, it sits beside you. There is a hidden place in Elder Willow, not marked on maps, not spoken of in market chatter. A small crevice in the stone wall near the south bend of the orchard path, just wide enough to press in a finger or a folded scrap of cloth. It is known only by those who need it, called the thread in the wall. Long ago, a girl in love with a weaver left behind a ribbon from her hair, unable to speak her truth aloud. Weeks later, she returned and found a length of spun flax tucked beside it, dyed the same color. Since then, the wall has been a place for quiet confessions, not prayers, not declarations, but secrets wrapped in thread and left for time to answer. Elswith returned there one dusk, long after her voice had told every story, long after her steps were known by every brick and trail. In her hand, a small twist of cloth. She didn't say what it held, but she pressed it gently into the stone, tucking it beside a scrap of blue, a braid of gold, and a child's drawing of a heart. Corwin stood beside her. "You left something," he said. She nodded. "Not to be found, just to rest." They didn't wait for an answer, because some truths don't call back. They simply echo. Years later, when someone, somewhere, finds your thread and knows they're not alone. Now imagine, you carry a piece of your heart for years, unspoken, unopened. One day, you leave it in a quiet place, not to be read, but to be felt. And in doing so, you set something free. Because love doesn't always need response. Sometimes, it only needs release. In the time of harvests and hornpipes, Elder Willow was once known for its dances. There were fiddlers on barrels, pipers on porches, and feet that struck the earth like drums. But not all dances required sound. Some required only remembrance. They called it the dance without music. It happened rarely. No stage, no instruments, no announcement. Just two people, often older, sometimes unsure, standing in an open place, market square, orchard, garden path, and beginning to move, together, slowly, without rhythm, but not without reason. Their steps were shaped by years, not measures, by memories of hands held through trial, by movements practiced in kitchens, by hearths, in rooms too narrow to call a ballroom. One evening, as the lanterns were being hung for the autumn night fire, Ellsworth and Corwin stood alone beneath the garland tree. Someone nearby hummed a note by accident. They looked at each other, and they danced. No beat, no lead, no audience, save a fox and a flickering flame. They moved as if recalling a dream, not to impress, to remember. A few children watched from behind crates of apples. One whispered, "What are they doing?" An elder replied, "Listening to something we can't hear." Ellsworth stepped back once. Corwin followed. She turned, he turned, and when they met in the center, her forehead touched his. No final dip, no bow, just breath and stillness. Now imagine, you have moved through a life with someone, step by step. One day, without prompting, you find yourselves dancing, not to music, but to memory, because the body remembers what the heart cannot say aloud. And love, after all, has its own silent song. There is a mirror in Elder Willow, small, framed in ashwood, hung not in a grand hall, but at the bend of a narrow hallway in the old weaving house. They say it doesn't reflect the present. It reflects the first time you truly saw someone. It's called the mirror of first sight. Not magic, not enchanted, just honest. When two people stand before it together, their reflections shift, not into youth or beauty, but into memory. It shows the version of each other they first fell in love with. Not always the moment of meeting, sometimes later, sometimes quieter. A glance during an argument, a kindness shared when no one else was watching, a joke that landed like a key unlocking something soft. Ellsworth and Corwin came upon the mirror during the last frost walk of the year. The weaving house was being restored. A worker said, jokingly, "Careful, it might make you fall in love all over again." They stepped inside, unsure why, and stood, side by side. At first, nothing strange, just two older faces, lined, kind, familiar. Then, shift. Corwin blinked. He saw her, not in youth, but in courage, the way she had looked on the morning of the trial of 3 customs. Eyes full of fire, jaw set against fate. Ellsworth gasped. She saw him, sitting in the room between seasons, asleep in a chair, a half-read book in hand, keeping vigil through her fever. They didn't speak, only smiled. Then the mirror returned to normal, and they stepped away, together. Now, imagine, you've looked at someone for a lifetime, and one day, you see them not as they are, but as they were when you first knew. This was home, because love doesn't fade, it deepens, until it becomes everything you remember. In Elder Willow, loss was not a shadow to be feared, it was a seat to be saved. And once a year, the village celebrated a tradition not with mourning, but with light, the festival of empty chairs. At dusk, wooden chairs of every size and shape were arranged in the village square, some simple, some carved, some so old the grain had worn thin from decades of hands. Each chair represented someone no longer among them, but not forgotten. No names were spoken, no eulogies read. Instead, families brought something small, a scarf, a loaf of bread, a painted stone, a spoon. They placed the tokens on the chairs, and then they danced. Ellsworth and Corwin arrived late. They moved slowly, hand in hand, carrying a small ribbon-wrapped book. They chose a narrow chair, dark with age. Corwin placed the book down. It was the first story Ellsworth had ever written him. She touched the chair's backrest and whispered, still part of the circle. Then they joined the others. Children ran between the rows, careful not to disturb the offerings. Lanterns floated overhead. Music played, not loud, not solemn, something in between, like breath between sentences. And the chairs sat like witnesses, not asking for grief, only presence. Now imagine, you remember someone not by silence, but by celebration. You leave a space open, not out of sorrow, but out of honor. And in doing so, you say what needs no words. You are still here, you are still loved. Some traditions glow brightest when the year is nearly spent. In Elderwillow, as winter's edge crept near and frost whispered along the window panes, the village gathered for one final celebration, the night of last lanterns. It was a night not of endings, but of hopes not yet fulfilled. Everyone, young or old, crafted a lantern from what they had: parchment, cloth, birch bark, even old recipe pages or song sheets. Inside each lantern, they tucked a single wish, not read aloud, not shown, only known to the flame. When night fell, the lanterns were lit and carried to the edge of the river. No shouting, no ceremony, just the rustle of boots in snow, the flicker of color against dark. Each person released their lantern into the current, some steady, some spinning, some caught briefly on reeds, until they drifted on, glowing like fireflies in procession. Ellsworth and Corwin arrived late, their lantern made from linen and willow bark, stitched with quiet thread. Together, they lit it. She whispered her wish. He did too. Then they let it go. It floated for a long time, straight and slow. And just before it vanished from view, a gust of wind caught it, lifting it slightly, as if the river itself had sighed. They didn't need to watch it disappear. They had already released what mattered. Now imagine, you send something fragile into the dark, not to control it, not to chase it, but to let it be. And in that act, you remind yourself, wishing is not weakness, it is belief made visible. In Elderwillow, no fire burns forever, not even the sacred ones. And when a hearth that has warmed generations begins to fade, it is not smothered, nor abandoned, it is laid to sleep. The villagers call it the hearth's last spark, a moment not of farewell, but of thanks, for the warmth it gave, for the meals it cooked, for the stories it listened to in silence. The room between seasons had served as Ellsworth and Corwin's heart for many years. Its hearth had seen laughter, illness, dancing, grief, and quiet. Now the woodpile stood low. The kettle no longer steamed as often. One evening, Ellsworth rose and said, "It's time." She brought out the last piece of wood, one marked with an old knot, in the shape of a spiral. Corwin lit it with a single match, and together they watched as the flame rose, then softened, then curled into embers. Before it died completely, Ellsworth bent down. She took a small iron spoon, pressed it into the ash, lifted it. On the spoon's back, the last spark shimmered, brief and golden. She carried it outside, placed it gently into a lantern, closed the lid. That lantern now sat on their windowsill, unlit, but present. A reminder, the fire rests, but the warmth remains. Now imagine, you say goodbye not to what you've lost, but to what has served you well. You don't mourn the quiet, you honor it, because even when the flame goes out, the glow never truly leaves. Some leave, some return, but a few choose to stay. Not because the place is perfect, not because it holds all answers, but because it has become part of them, and they part of it. In Elderwillow, that choice is marked not by deed or oath, but by something far simpler, the stone of staying. At the edge of the orchard path, where the trees begin to thin and the world opens wide again, there is a wall, low, moss-covered and humble. In this wall, villagers who decide to stay forever, not only in body but in spirit, place a stone, any stone, so long as it's been carried with intention. It might come from a garden path, a creek bed, a pocket from travels long past. Each stone is nestled into the mortar, sometimes painted, sometimes plain. No names, no plaques, only the knowing. On the morning after the hearth's last spark, Ellsworth and Corwin walked the orchard path. Each held a small stone, hers, pale, river-washed, with a faint crack across the middle, his, darker, speckled, round as a seed. They reached the wall, found two open spaces, pressed the stones gently into place. No one watched, no one needed to, because the wall did not keep things out. It held them in. Stories, seasons, love. Now imagine, you have wandered long enough, and one day, you place something simple, something solid, into the earth and say, "Here, I will be part of this," and the world answers not with noise, but with stillness, because staying is the loudest vow silence can offer. In every village, there comes a time when those who once lived stories begin to hold them instead, not to rewrite, not to retell, but to protect, to pass them forward, gently, honestly, and with care. In Elderwillow, this person is known as the keeper of threads. The role is not granted, it's recognized. When someone listens more than they speak, when their eyes soften at memories not their own, when they sit beside the young and ask not what do you know, but what do you remember, then the others know. The threads are safe in their hands. Ellsworth had never sought such a title, but stories, like seasons, found their way to her. Children brought her drawings of dreams. Young couples asked her about the spoon ceremony. Strangers placed seeds at her gate without asking why. And one quiet morning, a girl knocked at her door, carrying a ribbon with 7 knots. "This was my grandmother's," she said, "but I don't know what it means." Ellsworth didn't answer right away. She opened her chest, took out a strip of cloth marked with matching knots. "It means," she said softly, "someone in your family once chose to stay." And the girl smiled, as if remembering something she'd never known. From that day on, the children began to call her Thread Mother. She did not correct them. Corwin only chuckled. "Careful," he whispered. "They'll start writing you into the stories next." Ellsworth smiled. "Let them try. Now imagine. You become not the main character, but the quiet presence in someone else's tale. You listen, you remember, you preserve, and in doing so you realize the keeper is not the hero. She is the home the story returns to. In most places, when you let go of something, a letter, a wish, a whisper into the wind, you expect it to vanish. But Elderwillow has its own way of answering. Sometimes, wishes return. It happened late in autumn, just as the leaves were giving up their grip on the trees. A young boy was walking the river's edge when he found it. A lantern, faded, worn, but intact. Inside, a slip of parchment still dry, still curled. He brought it to the room between seasons, unsure of where else to go. Ellsworth opened the door. Corwin stood just behind her, holding a brush dipped in apple glaze. The boy held out the lantern. It came back. Ellsworth turned it slowly in her hands. Recognition bloomed in her eyes. It was their lantern, the one they had sent downstream during the night of last lanterns, so many seasons ago. She opened the lid. The parchment fell into her palm. Still legible, still whole. She read it silently, then smiled. Corwin asked, "What did we wish for?" She looked up. "We wished to be remembered," and they had been. By the river, by the wind, by the child who brought the lantern home. They placed the lantern in the window again, not as a farewell this time, but as a welcome. Its light flickered gently, not burning, just waiting. Now imagine, you send something out with no guarantee. You let it drift, not knowing if it will ever reach anything at all. Then, long after you've forgotten the shape of your own hope, it returns, changed, worn, but full of quiet promise. Because sometimes, the world answers. It just takes its time. As the nights grew longer, and Elderwillow slipped gently into winter, the villagers prepared not with fear, but with fabric. For in this village, warmth did not come only from firewood or furs. It came from stories, from needle and thread, from remembrance made tangible. They called it the quilt of seasons. Each household contributed a single square, no larger than a hand, no rules about color or shape, only one requirement. It must come from something that mattered, a piece of a wedding sash, a patch from a child's first blanket, a threadbare scarf from a long walk home. Each square was stitched into a growing quilt, tended through the decades by those who remembered the old patterns and trusted new ones. That winter, Ellsworth and Corwin delivered their final square. It was made from the linen of their first shared pillow, slightly faded, still smelling faintly of time. They embroidered 2 things upon it, a spoon and a flame. When the quilt was unveiled in the village hall, it spanned nearly the entire north wall. Children sat beneath it, tracing stories with their fingers. Elders stood back, their eyes misted not from age, but from warmth deeper than wool. One child asked, "Will it ever be finished?" The weaver smiled, "Only when the stories stop," and everyone knew that would never happen. Now imagine, you place a piece of your life among others, not to make it stand out, but to help it keep others warm. And one day, someone you'll never meet wraps themselves in your memory and feels safe. Because love, when shared, becomes shelter. In Elderwillow, most doors had locks, not for fear, but for the pleasure of unlocking, of welcoming, of choosing who came in. But there was one key, small, iron, curled at the end like a fern, that was never used to keep anyone out. It was always left hanging, by the door to the room between seasons. Some say it had once belonged to a traveling bard who never stayed long enough to call anywhere home, until one winter he found the room open, a ribbon on the table, and stayed 3 days longer than planned. He left the key behind, with a note, for whoever comes next, not to take, but to enter. Ellsworth and Corwin kept the tradition. Each time they cleaned the threshold, they made sure the key was still there, hanging from its hook, untouched but polished, ready. They didn't speak of it often, but they noticed when children glanced at it, when guests ran fingers across it, when a certain kind of silence fell around it. One late afternoon, as twilight deepened and frost ghosted the window panes, a young woman, hooded, travel-worn, quiet, stood outside their door. She didn't knock, she simply looked at the key. Ellsworth stepped out, holding a mug of warm clove cider. "It's for you if you need it," she said. The woman nodded. "I won't stay long." "You don't have to," Corwin added, appearing with a second mug. "But you're welcome to stay as long as you need." That night, the key stayed on its hook, but the room was warm again. Now imagine, you leave something behind, not for safety, but for invitation. You expect nothing. But one day, someone steps across your threshold, tired and unsure, and they find, waiting for them, not a locked door, but a key and a place to rest. In Elderwillow, every kitchen had a cupboard of oddities, a plate that didn't match the others, a fork with a bent tine, a bowl painted by a child and kept long after the child grew. But the most treasured of these was always the same, the cup with no match, once part of a set, once belonging to a pair, now singular, still used, and always kept at the front of the shelf. It was not held in pity, nor tucked away for shame. It was proof, tangible, humble, that something once belonged and still mattered, even after becoming one again. Some used it when guests came, offering it without apology. Others used it for themselves, sipping slowly on quiet mornings, as if honoring the space left beside it. Ellsworth had such a cup, soft clay, glazed unevenly, one side warmer than the other. Corwin had dropped its mate years ago during a storm, reaching too fast for a kettle. He had apologized for days. She only smiled and said, "Now it's more like us, still here, still useful, still lovely." One evening, long after the last frost, a young couple visiting the manor was served tea. The woman took the odd cup. "It doesn't match," she said gently. Ellsworth nodded. "That's why I gave it to you." "Why?" "Because sometimes, not matching is the beginning of real belonging." Now imagine, you keep something broken, incomplete, not to fix it, but to honor it. And one day, you offer it to someone who needs to know. You don't need to match to matter. You don't need to pair to be whole. Some things are beautiful because they stand alone. Most windows in Elderwillow were modest, cloth pulled tight, wooden shutters drawn in storms, light controlled with care, protected from prying eyes, from cold, from change. But there was one window in the room between seasons that had never known a curtain, not even once. They called it the honest pane. It faced east, caught the morning, held the moon. Anyone walking past could see inside, see the teapot, the feathered spoons, the slow shuffle of slippers on old floorboards, and inside those who lived there could see the world passing by. A fox trotting at dawn, a child chasing their own shadow, a lantern drifting gently after dark. Ellsworth had considered covering it, once, in the early days, when everything still felt tender. But Corwin had placed a hand on the frame and said, "We've spent too much of our lives behind veils. Let this one thing stay open." She agreed, and over the years that window became more than glass. It became invitation. Visitors often paused beneath it, sometimes to wave, sometimes to rest. One child once pressed a flower to the sill and whispered, "You look happy in there." Ellsworth had smiled, not because she felt happy every day, but because the child saw truth, not performance. Now imagine, you leave one part of your life uncovered, not for display, but for connection. You let the world look in, not to judge, but to witness. And in that gentle exposure, you find peace. Because some homes don't need fences, they need light. At the center of Elderwillow's library, between shelves of weathered lore and stitched parchments, sat a single curious volume. A book with no title, no author, no final page. Its cover was soft from use, its binding loose in places, and inside, handwriting of 100 kinds. Some entries were long, others barely a line, some inked with careful precision, others scrawled in haste, almost like a secret too urgent to keep, but none signed, none dated, because the book wasn't meant to record who, it was meant to remember what mattered. It was known as the book without ending, and its only rule was simple: Write only when you know you must. Ellsworth had visited the book for years without writing. She had touched it, turned its pages, whispered thanks, but never added a word until the year the room between seasons was no longer hers to keep. She stood before the book, alone, placed her hand gently upon it, and finally wrote, "We stayed. Through strangeness and silence, through fire and frost, through knowing and unknowing, and when the time came to leave, we chose not to." Then she closed it and left. Later, a young weaver read the passage. She didn't know the name, didn't need to. She just smiled and whispered, "I think I'll stay too." Now imagine, you write not to be remembered, but to remind. Your words are not a monument, they are a seed. And one day, long after your voice has quieted, someone will read them and grow. Because some books never end, they continue. In the early years, the villagers of Elderwillow used to run from rain. Close shutters, cover heads, hide bread under thick cloth. Rain meant delay, meant mess, meant remembering things they'd rather forget. But as time softened the village's fears, the rain began to change. Or rather, they changed with it. Now, when the clouds gathered low and full, something different stirred. Laughter, stillness, shoes left at thresholds, so toes could feel the cold stone wet beneath them. They began calling it the rain that doesn't scare. It fell gently, soft as breath on a mirror, and those who had lived long enough understood. This is what love feels like, after it has lasted. Not a storm, not a flood, just steady, just enough. One such rain came late one afternoon, as Ellsworth and Corwin sat under the willow by the river. No rush to move, no need to seek shelter. She tilted her face upward. He rested his hand on her shoulder. Neither spoke, because neither needed to. The children nearby played in the puddles. The elders walked slower, not faster, and someone placed a candle on the edge of a stone and watched as its flame flickered, not from fear, but from joy. Now imagine, you once feared what might fall, words, weather, endings, but one day, you simply let it come. You do not hide, you open your hands, and find that some things fall not to harm, but to bless. Most doors in Elderwillow opened outward, toward garden paths, muddy lanes, windswept porches. But there was one, older than most, with hinges worn smooth from generations of gentle use. It opened inward, always inward. It belonged to a house no longer lived in, tucked near the bend where the orchard kissed the edge of the forest. Children called it the listening house. Travelers said it smelled like cinnamon and pine. No one claimed it, and yet everyone cared for it. They left bread at the sill, a book on the chair, fresh kindling beside the stove. Because in Elderwillow, the house had come to mean something else entirely. It wasn't a place to live. It was a place to remember how it feels to be home. Ellsworth and Corwin visited once each season. They never brought much, sometimes just a folded ribbon, or a tin of tea, or silence. And each time they opened that door and stepped inside, it felt like something in them unlocked as well. Ellsworth once whispered, standing in the hallway, "This is how I know we stayed for the right reasons." Corwin nodded, touching the frame. "Because even when we leave, this feeling follows us." And that, the villagers said, was the secret of the inward opening door. It wasn't designed to keep the world out. It was shaped to remind you, you are welcome, here, now, always. Now imagine, you return to a space, not to own it, not even to stay, but to remember yourself. And as the door swings inward, something within you opens too. Because home is not where you live, it's where you are known. In Elderwillow, when a story ended, it wasn't torn, it wasn't buried, it was tied, gently, thoughtfully, with hands that knew the texture of time. They called it the final ribbon. No grand ceremony, no crowd, just a quiet moment between the one who had lived the tale and the one who would remember it. Ellsworth kept her ribbons in a wooden box, every one from a season past, some frayed, some bright, all meaningful, but one, the last one, she saved. Not the most beautiful, not the oldest, just honest. A ribbon dyed from beetroot and rainwater, stiff at the ends, soft at the middle, worn from being touched too often. On the morning the room between seasons passed into new hands, she stood in the doorway, alone. Corwin was already waiting near the river, where the lanterns had once floated. She took the ribbon, wrapped it around the door's handle, tied it, not tightly, not loosely, just enough to hold. A knot, not a bow, not meant to be untied, meant to stay. The new keeper would find it, and know, Not all stories close with silence. Some close with softness. When Ellsworth rejoined Corwin, he said nothing. He just took her hand, and for once she said, "That chapter is finished," to which he replied, "And the book is still open." Now imagine, you reach the end of something not with grief, but with grace. You don't tear the page. You don't slam it shut. You simply tie it off, because endings don't have to be sharp. They can be gentle. Near the north edge of Elderwillow, where the meadows sloped toward the river and shadows stretched longer in the afternoon, stood two trees, not planted together, not even the same kind, one an ash, one an elder, different bark, different leaf, different way of reaching for the sun, and yet, over the years, their roots had grown toward one another, intertwining beneath the soil, invisible and unbreakable. Between them sat a bench, nothing ornate, just oak, smoothed by time and weather. The villagers didn't mark it, didn't dedicate it, but they all knew what it meant. They called it the Lover's Rest. It was said that if you sat there, alone or with another, you'd feel the quiet hum of love that didn't need to speak anymore, the kind that had weathered winters, changed with seasons, grown not in spite of difference but because of it. One autumn afternoon, Ellsworth and Corwin found their way there, slowly, hand in hand, no need for destination. They sat, no rush, no story left to tell, only the rustling above, the warmth at their shoulders, and the roots beneath, holding more than memory. Corwin looked up once. "Think they'll plant a third someday?" Ellsworth smiled, eyes closed. "No need. We already grew together." They didn't move for a long time. They didn't need to, because sometimes the greatest journey ends not in motion, but in stillness shared. Now imagine, you live a life beside someone, not always matching, not always mirroring, but growing. One day you stop, sit beneath the branches that have witnessed it all, and realize you've become part of the landscape. In the heart of Elderwillow's library, behind the shelves of shared journals and ancestral cookbooks, there was a drawer, small, locked by time, not by key. Inside it rested a single vial, half full, sealed with beeswax, its color deep as plum. The ink was known only as memory root. It was said to be made from a mixture of elderflower sap, ash bark, and the tears of storytellers, gathered during the first winter that the village had truly learned to stay. This ink did not fade, not in sunlight, not with rain, not even in forgetting. Anything written with it became part of the place, not just read, felt. When a life neared its final season, the elders offered the ink to those whose words had carried others. This year, the vial passed to Ellsworth. She accepted it without pride, without reluctance, just with knowing. She used it to write a single page, no title, no flourish, just one line. We stayed, not because we had to, but because the world needed a place where love would not be erased. She placed the page into the book without ending, and closed it. The ink shimmered faintly, like fire held in a breath. Corwin saw it and said, "Then it's done." She smiled. "No, now it begins again. Now imagine. You are given the chance to write one truth that will never be lost. You dip your pen, you press it to the page. You do not fear time, because some words do not grow old, they grow roots." There's a step outside the room between seasons. Stone, cracked, warmed by decades of sun and softened by hundreds of goodbyes. At certain times of day, a shadow falls across it, just a sliver, just long enough to remind whoever stands there, something has passed, but not away. The villagers call it the shadow on the step, not because it haunts, but because it honors. In Elderwillow, when someone leaves, whether for another place, another season, or another realm, they are never spoken of as gone. They are carried forward, and each time the light shifts and casts a silhouette where a figure once stood, someone will pause and say, "Still with us," not in body, but in the way the air feels warmer there, in the way stories lean gently toward that place. Ellsworth stood on that step one twilight, alone, not sad, not searching, just standing. A breeze brushed her shoulder. She did not turn, but she whispered, "Thank you." Corwin joined her moments later. He took her hand. They didn't speak of the shadow, because they knew it wasn't a goodbye, it was a continuation. Now imagine, you feel a presence, not beside you, but within you. Something you once feared losing, now simply lives differently. You let it be. You step through it, not away from it. Because letting go is not forgetting, it is remembering with grace. At the edge of Elderwillow, where the moss grows thick on the old stone gate, and the wind carries the scent of lavender and soil. There is a spot where voices seem to linger. Not echoes, not ghosts, just warmth hanging in the air like smoke from a hearth. They call it the voice at the gate. It's where farewells are spoken, where promises are whispered, where no one is ever truly alone. The villagers say that if you stand there quietly, just before dawn or just after rain, you'll hear it, the voice of someone you love, not saying anything new, just saying your name, softly, like a memory that's never finished saying goodbye. Corwin often visited the gate when sleep eluded him. He never stayed long. He never expected anything. But one evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the crickets began their song, he heard her. "Corwin," the air said, "come home." He didn't jump, didn't panic. He simply smiled and turned back toward the village, because sometimes the voice isn't outside you, it's in you, and sometimes it's enough just to be reminded. Now imagine, you carry a voice not in your ears but in your bones, and one day, standing in the quiet, you hear it again, not because it returned, but because you finally paused long enough to listen. Because love doesn't vanish, it lingers. It was easy to overlook, just a single feather, cream-colored, barely the length of a spoon, lying on the table in the room between seasons, quiet as breath, lighter than memory. But in Elder Willow, such things were never ignored. They were seen, held, understood. They called it the feather on the table, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. Ellsworth once said, "When we no longer search for signs, that's when they start to appear." And so when the feather appeared, no windows open, no bird nearby, Corwin didn't ask why. He simply smiled, picked it up, placed it beside the old fan, then sat and waited. Later that evening, a breeze drifted through the open door, not cold, not urgent, just enough to move the feather slightly and stop. And Corwin whispered, not to anyone in particular, "I remember." No reply, no magic, just peace. Because sometimes signs don't come to guide, they come to comfort. Now imagine, you find something small, feather, pebble, scent, and for a moment, the world feels closer. You don't need an explanation, because your heart knows before your mind can speak. You are not alone. In Elder Willow, not everything was passed down. Not every keepsake was meant to be held forever. Some things, after all their giving, all their meaning, were meant to return, to the soil, to the silence, to the cycle. So it was with the most sacred of objects, the spoon. Long ago, when Ellsworth and Corwin first chose each other, they shared a wooden spoon, simple, worn smooth by soup and stories, by laughter and illness, by every moment that passed quietly between them. It became more than an object, it became them. But seasons turn, and even love, like a spoon, changes shape. One morning, when the frost was just beginning to lift, and the garden's edge glimmered with dew, Ellsworth wrapped the spoon in linen and placed it in a small wooden box. Corwin dug a hole beneath the old apple tree, the one they had planted in their second year. She laid the box inside. They covered it with earth. No stone, no sign, only knowing. "It's not an ending," she said. "It's a returning," he agreed. And every spring, the apples from that tree tasted sweeter. Not because of magic, but because something once loved had gone back to where it began. Now imagine, you take something precious, soaked with memory, and give it back. Not out of loss, but out of love. Because the earth remembers, and what you let go grows again. In Elder Willow, there was a time each year when the rain did something strange. It didn't come with thunder, didn't arrive in sheets, didn't demand shelter. It drifted in gently, like a curtain being pulled across the world. A curtain not of water alone, but of light. They called it the rain light. Not every villager saw it the same way. Some said it shimmered like silver threads, others that it made the air glow rose gold, like a memory warming from within. But everyone agreed, it made you stop, not to seek cover, but to feel. The rainlight fell during early dusk, briefly, without announcement. One moment the sky was quiet, then sparkling, not with sun, but with something else, something between. Corwin and Ellsworth stood by the open window as it arrived. No words, just the soft hush of droplets falling through light. It touched the leaves, it danced along the rooftop, it kissed the sill and stayed there, humming. Ellsworth whispered, "It feels like goodbye." Corwin answered, "No, it feels like everything is still here, just shimmering differently." They reached out together, catching a drop on their fingertips, and smiled. because sometimes what falls also shines. Now imagine, you witness something brief, beautiful, and unexplainable. You don't need to name it. You just stand in its glow, letting it remind you that even sorrow can shimmer, that even endings can sparkle, because what falls is not always lost. In the forests beyond Elderwillow, there was a clearing that no map could find. No trail led to it. No sign marked its entrance. And yet, everyone who needed it somehow found their way there. They called it the place with no path. It was never the same for any two people. For some, it appeared as a circle of moss beneath leaning trees. For others, a patch of golden wildflowers swaying without wind. And for a few, just a quiet place where the world finally stopped asking questions. Ellsworth first found it on a day when nothing made sense. Corwin had been ill. The village felt far away, and her thoughts, usually so orderly, spun like leaves in a storm. She walked without aim, without plan, just forward. And then, there it was, a hollow. Not special, not grand, but right. She sat, closed her eyes, and breathed. The ground held her, the silence steadied her, and though no one else was there, she did not feel alone. She returned once each year, never by the same way, always found it, never searched, and every time she whispered, "Thank you," though she never knew to whom. Now imagine, you lose your way, and instead of panic, you move gently, you trust your feet, and one day, without fanfare or direction, you arrive, not where you planned, but where you needed. Because not every path begins with a step, some begin with letting go. In most places, gifts are wrapped in reasons, birthdays, weddings, comings and goings. But in Elderwillow, there was a different tradition. No ribbon, no date, no need to explain, just a gift. Given simply because the heart was full. They called it the gift with no occasion. A warm loaf left on a doorstep, a small stone painted with stars, a note that read only, "You were on my mind," not planned, not expected, never owed, always felt. Ellsworth was both a giver and a receiver of such gifts. Once a child handed her a feather dipped in blue wax and said, "You looked like you needed something soft today." She kept it on the windowsill for years. Another time, she left a spoon carved from ashwood on the chair beside the weaver's loom. No signature, no question, only the quiet exchange of care. Corwin, too, once pressed a folded piece of cloth into her hand at the end of a long day. Inside, stitched with uneven thread, were 3 words, "Still choosing you." She never asked when he made it, only kissed his cheek and placed it in the drawer beside the kettle, where she'd see it every morning. Now imagine, you offer something, not because you're told to, but because love rises in you and asks to be shared, and you discover that giving is not a transaction, it is a language. And sometimes, the words are as simple as, "Here, just because." In Elderwillow, no cup was ever truly empty. Not because it magically refilled, not because someone always topped it off, but because somehow, over time, what had been poured out returned, differently, softly, like an echo you could drink. They called it the echo in the cup. It was said that when you gave freely, of comfort, of time, of presence, the cup you held, whether real or not, would one day return to your hands, not as repayment, as recognition. Ellsworth had served tea to strangers, broth to the grieving, spiced cider to the curious and the cold. She never kept track, never measured, and one winter morning, as snow fell in curls and the hearth still slept, she found a cup left on her doorstep, still warm, fragrant with cinnamon and elderberry. A note beneath it, scrawled in a child's hand, "For when you're tired and don't want to say so." She smiled, took the cup inside, sat, drank, and wept, not from sadness, but from being seen. Corwin, watching from the other room, only said, "Finally, now imagine, you give and give, never asking for return. But one day, quietly, something comes back to you. Not in the way you expected, but in the way you needed. Because kindness doesn't disappear, it echoes." In Elderwillow, goodbyes were rarely loud. No wailing, no trumpet of sorrow, no dramatic final steps. Only light, kept low, soft and steady, like the end of a candle's flame, like the breath just before a dream begins. They called it the last light. When someone departed, whether for a journey, for another village, or for the quiet walk into what comes next, a single lantern was lit and placed on the windowsill, not to be seen from afar, not to guide, just to say, "You were loved here, and you still are." Ellsworth and Corwin knew the time would come. They never feared it, only prepared gently. One evening, With twilight resting on the rooftops, they lit the lantern together, placed it on the sill. No words, no ritual, only presence. Elswith turned to Corwin and said, "Let's not speak of endings." He nodded, "Only of resting." They sat together, side by side, as the room filled with golden hush. No one came, no one needed to, because the light itself was witness enough. It burned until morning, and then it dimmed, not snuffed, as if exhaling, and the house held its silence like a lullaby. Now imagine, you don't fight the end, you meet it like an old friend. You lower the flame, not because you've lost it, but because it has warmed everything it needed to. And now it's time to sleep. Because some farewells are not thunder, they are peace. In stories, the last page is often where everything ends. But in Elder Willow, the garden kept growing, even after the doors had closed, even after the chairs had been stacked, even after Ellsworth and Corwin's last lantern had dimmed, the garden remained. They called it the garden that never closed. No one replanted it, no one owned it, and yet it blossomed. Perennials found their rhythm, wild herbs filled the corners, moss took to the stones like memories clinging to silence, and in spring, always one apple would fall before the others. Children came first, to chase butterflies, to pick mint leaves, to sit on the bench between the ash and elder trees. Then quiet visitors, those who'd read the book without ending, those who danced without music, those who still whispered at the gate. They left things behind, a drawing, a ribbon, a stone with a word etched faintly into it. Stay. No signs were posted, no fences built. But somehow, everyone knew, this is not just a garden, this is a continuation. The roots beneath it remembered footsteps. The petals leaned toward familiar names, and the soil still warm held stories like seeds. Waiting, not for an ending, but for the next beginning. Now imagine, you think the story has finished, but you return one day, quietly, and find something still blooming, something that didn't need you to watch it grow, only to know it came from love. Because some gardens aren't closed, they're kept. Years after the room between seasons fell into hush, after the last light had dimmed and the chairs had gathered dust, a sound returned to the hearth, whittling, soft, rhythmic, like wind carving through time. A young villager sat cross-legged before the fire, knife in hand, wood in lap. They weren't recreating, they were continuing. The spoon ceremony was still remembered, stories still told, not as relics, but as prompts. And so the child carved, not with perfection, but with presence. The spoon that emerged was longer than the old ones, its bowl deeper, its handle marked not with flowers, but with flames, not copies, echoes, not homage, inheritance. When they finished, they didn't display it, didn't declare it. They placed it in the center of the garden, under the apple tree, beside the roots that once received a different spoon, and whispered, "This one's not for keeping, it's for starting." Later that year, the spoon was gone, taken, most believed, but no one grieved, because they knew the story had found a new cook, a new fire, a new chapter. Now imagine, you hold something old, not to protect it from time, but to offer it to time. You carve not a replica, but a thread, and when you place it down, you do so knowing, this is not how stories end, this is how they travel. One spring evening, long after the names had faded from the lips of daily life, someone arrived in Elderwillow, not announced, not expected, just a figure with tired boots and eyes that searched the rooftops like they were trying to remember a dream. At the edge of the orchard path, they paused, closed their eyes, breathed, then walked forward, as if they knew the way, even if their feet had never touched this soil before. At the room between seasons, now tended by new hands, a single cup sat on the porch railing, steam rising, fragrant, waiting, no one around, no note, just warmth. The traveler didn't question. They sat, lifted the cup, sipped, and whispered, "I think I've been here before." Maybe they had, maybe not, but Elderwillow didn't care for such lines. It cared for feeling, and sometimes, arrival feels not like stepping into something new, but like returning to something that never truly let you go. Now imagine, you arrive in a place you've never seen, yet every breath tastes familiar. A cup waits for you, not because you're known, but because someone believed you'd come, because somewhere always keeps a place warm for you, just in case. In the village of Elderwillow, knots had always mattered. They tied promises into fabric, bound hopes to ribbons, held ceremonies, hands and seasons together. But one day, softly, almost invisibly, came a new kind of moment. the untying, not in anger, not in forgetting, but in release. A villager, now elder themselves, found an old ribbon tucked into a book, one tied long ago by someone who had since passed, and not so familiar it still held warmth in its folds. They held it in their lap, fingered its twist, then slowly, without ceremony, untied it. The ribbon didn't unravel, it didn't fall apart, it simply lay open, at peace. Ellsworth had once said, "We tie to remember, but we untie to trust." Corwin agreed, and to let what we loved become part of the world again. That day, as the ribbon rested, a breeze came through the open window. It lifted the cloth gently, carried it to the sill, and then no one chased it, because the love that tied it remained, and the knot's absence, that was not emptiness, that was freedom. Now imagine, you hold something for a long time, tight, careful, sacred. Then one day, your hands let go, not out of loss, but out of knowing. Because love isn't proved by how long you hold on. Sometimes, it's shown by how gently you let it fly. The table in the room between seasons had stood for decades. 4 legs, scratched top, warmed by countless hands and harvests. It had seen tears and feasts, arguments and quiet mornings with tea. It had known the weight of stories and the space between them. And after Corwin and Ellsworth had gone, it waited, not empty, not abandoned, just open. Then one day, a new chair appeared, not to replace, not to erase, just to join. A young weaver, drawn by stories she barely believed, had come to the village seeking only quiet. She found the house unlocked, the hearth swept, the spoons still hung by the window, and she understood, I don't have to start over, I just have to begin. So she pulled up a chair, not matching, not polished, just hers, and sat. Others came slowly, not in crowds, but as if drawn by gravity, by the knowing that something was stirring again. And as stories returned to the walls, no one questioned the new voice among them. Because love, when true, does not guard its seat, it adds another. Now imagine, you approach something sacred, not to take from it, but to add gently to its song. And instead of rejection, you find room, you find welcome. Because even after great love rests, new love still arrives, and there is always space at the table. It didn't begin with a spark. Not this time. It began with a hush, a breath, a match struck slowly, as if even the flame needed time to remember how to burn. In the room between seasons, the hearth had long gone cold, swept, honored, left undisturbed. But on a morning like any other, fog still hanging in the garden, dew clinging to the sill, a hand reached into the wood box, a twig, a curl of bark, a single piece of dried fruit wood. No speech, no prayer, just one small fire, lit quietly. The weaver didn't stand to watch it grow. She simply placed a kettle on the hook, sat in Corwin's old chair, and began to mend a seam. The flame grew, softly, steadily. It didn't roar, it settled, like something long awaited, had come home. Later that evening, someone walking past paused, saw the glow through the uncovered window, smiled, kept walking. Because in Elder Willow, you didn't need to knock on a lit home. You only had to know. Hope has returned, and it didn't need to announce itself. Now imagine, you start something again. Not loudly, not bravely, but gently. You let the warmth return, not because you shouted for it, but because you were ready for it. Because sometimes the world changes with a whisper. The floorboards in the room between seasons had softened over time. Their creaks were familiar, their sway, a rhythm of memory. They had once held the feet of Ellsworth and Corwin, spinning beneath ribbons, laughter rising like steam from cider. But after their last dance, the boards rested, waited, until one day they moved again. It wasn't planned, there was no music, only a humming, faint and unsure. The new keeper, broom in hand, paused in the middle of sweeping, felt something lift in her chest. She let the broom fall, took off her shoes, and turned slowly in place, once, twice, then smiled. Outside, a child laughed, mimicking her steps in the garden dirt. Inside, she danced, not to echo the past, but to answer it. A new rhythm, a new heartbeat, a new joy, rising not to replace, but to continue. Later that evening, she left the windows open, and if anyone walked by, they would hear not a song but movement, and know, someone is dancing again. The second first dance isn't louder, but it is braver, because it knows what came before, and still steps forward. Now imagine, you find yourself smiling again. Not like the first time, not without ache, but with the weight of what came before and the wonder that you still can. Because joy doesn't just return, it relearns. There are places we leave behind, rooms we walk out of, unsure if we'll return. Corners where laughter once echoed, now folded in quiet. But sometimes the place remembers, even when we forget. In Elderwillow, the room between seasons had become many things: a beginning, a resting place, a memory. But one afternoon, the weaver stood at the door, hand hovering above the latch, and felt something stir. Not in the air, but in her. Not, do I belong here? But, has this place been waiting for me? She opened the door. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. The spoon still hung, the cup still waited. The hearth glowed low, embers steady, like breath. She stepped inside, and the room seemed to exhale. Not welcome, recognition. She walked its edges, ran her hand along the walls, sat in a chair once loved, now hers. Not to reclaim, not to revive, but to remember. I never really left. It simply waited until I was ready to return. That evening, as moonlight stretched across the floor, she wrote a single line in the book without ending. I was found by the place I thought I lost. Now imagine, you return to a space you once thought forgotten, and instead of emptiness, you find presence. You find something quiet, that speaks without words. You were never unwelcome, because the places we love don't disappear. Sometimes, they find us again. There comes a moment in every long, winding story when even the tellers grow quiet, not from weariness, but from peace. In Elderwillow, when a life had been fully lived, stitched together from dancing and silence, spoons and shadows, tears and tea. Its final chapter did not close with alarm, it ended with something deeper: rest. They called it the sleep with no fear. Not everyone understood it, not everyone reached it, but those who did, you could see it in their eyes. A softness, a slowing, like a tide pulling back, not to escape, but to become part of something vast again. The weaver once asked the eldest among them, "How do you know when it's time?" The reply came gently: "When you can lie down in your own story and know nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be fixed, only held." That night, someone left the window ajar. The breeze moved through the room between seasons like a lullaby. The lantern dimmed, not extinguished. The quilt lay folded at the edge of the bed, and from within, a sigh, not of pain, of arrival. Now imagine, you've told your story, you've danced your dance, and at last, you lie down, not with questions, but with knowing, because some endings aren't endings at all. They're simply the moment when rest becomes sacred. And so, as the seasons turn and the lanterns grow quiet, one final detail remains, small, nearly forgotten, but never lost. On the old writing table in the room between seasons, beside the book without ending and a cup with no match, lies a ribbon, not folded, not tied, simply there, waiting. They call it the ribbon left untied. It does not mark an ending. It does not belong to the past. It belongs to whoever comes next. Some say it appeared on its own, lifted by the same breeze that once carried spoons, lanterns, and wishes. Others say someone placed it there, on purpose, with the soft hope that a story still unwritten might one day begin. The weaver, now older, does not touch it. She sees it every morning, smiles, and leaves it as it is, because one day, someone will walk through that door, not looking for history, not chasing legacy, just following a feeling. They will find the ribbon, and they will decide, it's time to begin. No ceremony, no instructions, only space and trust. Now imagine, you arrive at the end of a tale and find that no one has closed the book, no one has tied the ribbon, and that quiet decision to leave it open was not an accident, it was an invitation, because the story is not finished, it is simply yours now. Thank you so much, my friend. Good night.